Tonight, we're diving into the true story behind one of the greatest illusions in the history of the Imperium. The quiet, comforting belief that the Bene Gesserit sisterhood was always fully in control. Settle in now, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing here that can reach you, only a slow and even voice moving carefully through centuries of careful planning. And through every single moment that careful planning quietly, irreversibly slipped from their hands. If these long, quiet tellings are the ones that finally carry you under, a gentle subscribe keeps them coming, night after night, and that is the only small thing I will ask of you before we begin. Over the next 20 chapters we will follow, without haste, the complete history of the sisterhood's long, patient design, from the first seeds planted across 1,000 worlds, through Jessica's fateful choice, through a prophet they never authorized and a jihad they never wanted, all the way to the empire of sand that finally taught them the true, humbling difference between planning something and controlling it. You do not need to hold on to any of it, and none of it can touch you where you are. Let it move through you like a slow tide, and let it carry you softly down toward rest. There is a comforting story people across the Imperium like to tell about the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, that somewhere behind every throne and every marriage and every quiet, unremarkable conversation, a patient order of women held the entire, sprawling shape of human civilization firmly in their own careful hands. It was, in nearly every meaningful sense, a story more comfortable than it was true, and this history exists to tell, gently and completely, exactly how far the real, lived experience of the sisterhood diverged from that comforting legend across the centuries that actually unfolded. The Bene Gesserit did plan. That much the legend got entirely right. From their earliest founding, the order committed itself to thinking in spans of time no individual human life could ever hope to witness completed, tracking bloodlines across generations, seeding careful belief across 1,000 scattered worlds, and building an institutional memory so deep that individual sisters became, in some very real sense, custodians of a project considerably larger than any single one of them could ever fully comprehend on her own. But a plan built across centuries, dependent on the cooperation of countless individual people who never fully understood their own part within it, was never, honestly, the same thing as control. Control implies a hand steady enough to correct course the instant something drifts, a vision clear enough to see every consequence before it actually unfolds. The sisterhood possessed neither of these things in the totalizing way their own carefully cultivated reputation suggested, and this history intends to trace, patiently and without judgment, exactly where that gap between plan and control widened again and again across the long story that follows. Consider, for a moment, the sheer scale of what the sisterhood actually attempted. A breeding index stretching across noble houses throughout the entire Imperium, tracking genetic outcomes generations before any single participating family could understand the project's true purpose. A missionary program seeding protective religious belief across 1,000 isolated worlds, each seeding tailored carefully to local culture. Each one released into the world with no guarantee it would ever be needed, or that it would develop in quite the shape the sisterhood originally intended. No institution, however patient, however disciplined, however brilliant its individual members, could genuinely claim total control over a project unfolding across this many independent variables, this many individual human choices, this much span of time. The sisterhood themselves, in their more honest internal moments, seem to understand this limitation better than the wider Imperium ever gave them credit for. Their own training emphasized probability over certainty, careful observation over confident prediction, an entire philosophy built around narrowing outcomes rather than dictating them outright. Reverend Mothers spoke, in their most careful private teaching, of nudging rather than commanding, of patient cultivation rather than direct control, language that reveals, on close examination, an institution considerably more humble about its own actual power than the fearful whispers of outsiders ever suggested. And yet, even this more honest, more limited version of sisterhood ambition still assumed something the actual unfolding history would eventually prove false, that the general direction of their careful nudging could be reliably sustained across enough generations to reach its intended destination. What this complete history will trace, chapter after chapter, is exactly how thoroughly that assumption failed. Not through any single dramatic betrayal, but through an accumulating series of individual human choices, individual moments of love and fear and stubborn personal will, that the sisterhood's careful calculations simply could not fully anticipate or fully contain. It began in the specific chain of events this history will follow most closely, with a single woman given a single instruction on a quiet, unremarkable world. An instruction that seemed, at the time, like simply one more careful adjustment within a project already centuries deep. Nothing about that particular moment suggested it would become the exact point where the entire patient architecture the sisterhood had built across so many generations finally, irreversibly began to come apart. The particular tragedy and the particular grandeur of what follows lies precisely in how ordinary each individual step actually was. No single sister acted with malice. No single decision, examined in isolation, looked like betrayal. Jessica loved. Paul endured what was asked of him, and then endured considerably more than anyone asked. A galaxy responded to genuine suffering and genuine charisma in ways careful genetic planning had never accounted for. Because careful genetic planning cannot, in the end, account for what an entire population chooses to believe when a suffering, capable young man stands in front of them, promising deliverance. This history will not attempt to flatten the sisterhood into simple villains undone by their own hubris, nor into simple victims of forces entirely beyond anyone's reasonable expectation. The truth sits, as it usually does, somewhere considerably more complicated between those two comfortable extremes. The sisterhood built something remarkable, patient, and genuinely sophisticated. They also built it on an assumption, quiet and largely unexamined even by their own most careful leadership, that enough centuries of patient cultivation could eventually produce a result as reliable and as controllable as the careful genetic notation recording it on paper. What actually followed, across the specific chapters ahead, tells a rather different story, one of a plan that succeeded, in its narrowest technical sense, considerably faster and considerably more completely than the sisterhood ever intended, and which then proceeded, almost immediately, to escape every single hand that had ever tried to hold it. Consider, too, how differently this history might read if told purely from the perspective of outcomes rather than intentions. Judged only by results, the sisterhood's project succeeded almost beyond measure. A Kwisatz Haderach was produced. An empire was reshaped. Humanity itself was eventually driven to scatter across the stars in numbers and directions no single institution could have ever previously imagined possible. Judged instead by the much narrower question of whether the sisterhood actually retained command over how and when these outcomes unfolded, the picture looks considerably different. A long chain of genuine institutional success paired, again and again, with genuine institutional surprise at the specific shape that success actually took once it left their careful hands. It is worth remembering, too, that the sisterhood themselves rarely spoke of their own work using the language of total control. at least not in their most careful internal teaching. Reverend mothers trained their students instead in probability, in patient observation, in the careful narrowing of possible futures, rather than the confident dictation of any single guaranteed outcome. This more modest internal philosophy sat, throughout their entire history, in constant tension with the far grander reputation the wider imperium attached to them, a reputation built from fear and rumor rather than from anything the sisterhood's own most honest internal doctrine ever actually claimed for itself. That tension between modest internal philosophy and grand external reputation will recur throughout this telling in one form after another, and it is worth holding gently in mind as we move now toward the specific mechanisms, the seeded worlds and the careful bloodlines, through which the sisterhood actually attempted to shape the future they hoped for. There is a further layer worth naming here before this history moves toward its specific chain of events. The way institutions themselves tend to remember their own histories selectively, emphasizing the moments where careful planning appeared to succeed while quietly softening or reframing the moments where circumstance simply overwhelmed whatever careful planning had actually been attempted. The sisterhood, across their many centuries of accumulated internal record-keeping, proved no exception to this general institutional tendency, and part of what this complete history hopes to offer is exactly the kind of honest, unflinching accounting their own internal record rarely permitted itself. Not out of any particular disrespect for what they built, but out of genuine respect for how much more interesting and how much more genuinely instructive the full, complicated truth actually is compared to any simplified, comfortable legend. Sleep, in its own quiet way, offers exactly the right frame of mind for this kind of honest reckoning, a space where grand institutional narratives can soften into something more human, more forgiving, more able to hold complexity, without needing to resolve it into either simple triumph or simple failure. Let that gentleness stay with you now as this history continues, carrying you steadily forward through everything that actually happened, exactly as it actually happened, without any need to tidy it into a neater shape than the real, lived history ever actually possessed. This history asks you to hold two things at once as it unfolds: genuine admiration for what patient, disciplined institutional work can accomplish across enough generations, and genuine honesty about how thoroughly even the most disciplined work remains subject to forces no single institution can ever fully anticipate or fully master. Both things are true simultaneously, and neither one cancels out the other. Hold that gentle, complicated truth loosely as we begin, and let it settle rather than trouble you, because the story that follows, for all its scale and all its consequence, is ultimately a very human one. And human stories, however grand their setting, are always the kind sleep knows exactly how to carry you gently through. Up next in Chapter 2, 1,000 Worlds, 1,000 Unknowns, will uncover the Missionaria Protectiva's vast, centuries-long project of seated belief and the enormous uncertainty hidden quietly beneath its careful, patient design. The Missionaria Protectiva stands, in the sisterhood's own careful internal history, as perhaps their single most impressive demonstration of patient, long-term institutional planning, and yet, examined closely, it reveals precisely the kind of uncertainty this history intends to trace across every chapter that follows. The program's basic purpose was simple enough to state plainly: seeding protective religious belief and prophecy across isolated, dangerous worlds throughout the Imperium, so that any Bene Gesserit sister stranded there in some future crisis might invoke a prepared legend and secure safety among a population primed, generations in advance, to expect and to protect exactly the kind of stranger she would eventually become. What made the program remarkable was its sheer patience, agents trained extensively in comparative religion and local culture, dispatched to worlds that might not see a single sister actually need the seeded belief for centuries, if ever. What made the program genuinely uncertain, in a way the sisterhood's own confident public reputation rarely acknowledged, was that no seeding effort could actually guarantee how a population would develop the belief once it had been planted. Religious tradition, once released into a living, changing culture, takes on a life considerably beyond whatever its original architects intended, shaped by local circumstance, local crisis, local leaders whose own interpretations the sisterhood could not predict or control from centuries and often entire star systems away. This was, in the most literal sense available, a program built entirely around releasing carefully designed uncertainty into the galaxy and hoping, across generations, that enough of it would eventually prove useful in roughly the shape originally intended. The sisterhood understood this limitation better than outsiders assumed. Internal records maintained careful notes, not just on where seeding had occurred, but on how each population's belief had actually evolved over subsequent generations. Evidence of an institution monitoring outcomes it knew. From direct experience, it could not fully dictate. Arrakis received exactly this kind of careful seeding, generations before House Atreides ever arrived to govern it. A prophecy establishing the shape of a coming Messiah, complete with specific signs and specific expectations Fremen culture absorbed and preserved across centuries of desert survival. The sisterhood planted this particular seed for the most practical of reasons, ensuring that any stranded sister arriving among the Fremen could invoke recognized signs and secure protection rather than facing a suspicious, dangerous population with no framework for trusting an outsider. Nothing in the seeding's original design anticipated that the prophecy would eventually be claimed. Deliberately and with devastating effectiveness, not by a stranded sister seeking simple safety, but by a genuinely capable young man pursuing considerably larger ambitions entirely his own. The seed the sisterhood planted for narrow, practical protection would eventually flower into something the original planners never once intended. A religious and military movement capable of reshaping the entire Imperium, precisely because the underlying belief had grown across generations of genuine Fremen culture into something considerably more powerful and considerably less controllable than its original architects had ever designed it to become. This is the essential, uncomfortable truth sitting quietly beneath the Missionaria Protectiva's impressive scale, that a program built to plant 1,000 careful seeds across 1,000 worlds was, by its very nature, a program built to release 1,000 separate uncertainties into circumstances no single institution, however patient, however sophisticated, could ever fully track or fully contain. Each seeded world represented its own small, ongoing experiment in cultural development the sisterhood could observe, but never truly command. A patient investment in possibility rather than a guarantee of any particular outcome. Individual agents dispatched to conduct this seeding work understood this uncertainty intimately, even if the wider sisterhood's public reputation preferred to project considerably more confidence than the actual, lived experience of the program ever justified. These agents studied local culture with genuine anthropological rigor precisely because they knew a poorly integrated seed would either fail to take root at all or, worse, develop in some unpredictable direction entirely disconnected from its intended protective purpose. A risk considerable enough that the sisterhood invested heavily in training agents capable of minimizing it as much as possible, while never fully eliminating it. The scale of this uncertainty compounds considerably when multiplied across the program's full historical scope, 1,000 worlds each carrying their own particular version of seeded belief. evolving across their own particular local circumstances, monitored as closely as distance and resources allowed, but never actually controlled in any meaningful, moment-to-moment sense. What the sisterhood built, across centuries of patient work, was not a network of obedient outcomes, but a vast, scattered field of carefully planted possibility, most of it destined to remain quietly dormant, unused and unremarkable, and a small portion of it destined to grow into something considerably larger and considerably less predictable than anyone who first planted it could have possibly imagined. Arrakis was simply the world where this underlying uncertainty finally, spectacularly resolved itself into consequence. And this history will trace, across the chapters immediately ahead, exactly how a seed planted for one narrow, practical purpose grew instead into the single event that would unravel nearly everything else the sisterhood had spent so many patient centuries building. It helps, in trying to understand the true scale of this uncertainty, to imagine the Missionaria Protectiva not as a single coordinated program, but as something closer to a garden planted across 1,000 separate plots of soil. Each plot governed by its own particular climate, its own particular history, its own particular mixture of existing belief and existing custom. A gardener can choose what seed to plant and can prepare the soil as carefully as patience allows. But no gardener, however skilled, can fully dictate exactly how each individual seed will eventually grow once released into conditions this varied and this far beyond any single hand's ongoing reach. Some seeds took root exactly as intended, quiet, protective legends waiting patiently for a stranded sister who might never actually arrive to claim them. Others grew in directions no careful planning could have anticipated, absorbed into local tradition and reshaped by generations of believers who made the story genuinely their own long before any outside agent returned to check on what had actually become of it. The agents themselves, dispatched across these many worlds, carried a particular kind of institutional humility that the wider sisterhood's fearsome reputation rarely allowed outsiders to see. A genuine respect for how thoroughly a population's own lived experience could reshape even the most carefully designed prophecy, and a genuine acceptance that their own careful intentions, however well considered at the moment of planting, would not be the only force determining what that intention eventually became. This quiet humility, present in the actual practice of the program even where it rarely appeared in the sisterhood's public reputation, offers an early, important clue to the larger pattern this history intends to trace, that even the sisterhood's own most confident public legend concealed, underneath, a considerably more uncertain and considerably more humble private reality. The specific worlds chosen for Missionaria Protectiva seeding tended to share certain practical qualities that made them attractive targets for this kind of long-term investment: relative isolation from major imperial transportation routes, populations still developing their own religious and cultural traditions rather than already possessing rigid, fully settled belief systems resistant to outside influence, and enough basic habitability that a stranded sister might plausibly survive there long enough to actually need the protection the seeded belief was designed to eventually provide. Agents selecting these worlds combined careful demographic analysis with considerable field judgment, weighing factors that no simple formula could fully capture on its own. Arrakis, when Bene Gesserit agents first identified it as a candidate for this kind of seeding many generations before Paul's own birth, presented an unusually promising combination of these qualities. A population living under conditions harsh enough to value protective belief highly, isolated enough that outside cultural influence remained limited, and organized enough around shared communal survival that a carefully designed prophecy could plausibly spread and take root across the many scattered CH communities scattered throughout the deep desert. It is worth remembering that the sisterhood themselves rarely spoke of any individual seeding effort as a finished, completed project. Each planted belief remained, in their own careful internal accounting, an ongoing situation requiring periodic reassessment rather than a settled outcome. An institutional habit of mind that reveals, once again, just how clearly they understood the underlying uncertainty this chapter has been tracing. The considerable cost of maintaining this program across so many worlds and so many centuries deserves mention here as well. Funded through the Sisterhood's own accumulated wealth and requiring a sustained institutional commitment few other organizations throughout the Imperium could have plausibly matched across a comparable span of time. None of this diminished the program's overall value, only its claim to anything resembling total predictive certainty. Up next in Chapter 3, The Breeding Index's Blind Spot, we'll uncover the genetic project running alongside this religious seeding and the same fundamental uncertainty hidden quietly within its own careful, patient design. Running alongside the Missionaria Protectiva's religious seeding and exceeding it considerably in genetic ambition, the Bene Gesserit breeding index represented the Sisterhood's second great long-term project, a comprehensive genealogical record tracking marriages and pairings across noble bloodlines throughout the Imperium, all working patiently toward a single genetic goal the Sisterhood called the Kwisatz Haderach, a figure capable of accessing both male and female ancestral memory simultaneously, a capability every female sister, bound entirely to her own maternal line, could never achieve regardless of her own training or her own genetic favor. The index itself demanded a scale of patience difficult to fully appreciate from any single human perspective. Agents working within noble households across generations, encouraging particular marriages, occasionally intervening more directly when a genetic combination seemed sufficiently important to warrant closer attention. All of it contributing to a project whose true completion lay generations beyond any individual sister's own working lifetime. Most participating families never understood the program's actual scope, encouraged toward specific unions through careful guidance that revealed only the smallest fragment of the centuries spanning purpose their own children's births were actually serving. This deliberate compartmentalization protected the program's integrity in one important sense, ensuring no single family's ambition or resistance could meaningfully disrupt a plan whose true scale remained visible only to the Sisterhood's own highest leadership. But this same compartmentalization created the exact blind spot this chapter intends to name honestly. Because a project this vast, depending on the cooperation of countless individual people across countless generations who understood only fragments of their own role within it, could never actually be controlled in the totalizing sense the word control usually implies. It could be guided, patiently and carefully, across enormous spans of time. It could not be commanded, moment to moment, choice by individual choice, the way a single controlled experiment might be managed within a single laboratory across a single afternoon. The Sisterhood's own calculations, refined across centuries of accumulated genetic observation, projected the breeding index's completion still one full generation away when Lady Jessica received her own specific assignment within the wider project, instructed explicitly to bear Duke Leto Atreides a daughter whose eventual marriage to a particular Harkonnen heir would complete the genetic convergence the entire index had been patiently building toward across so many prior generations of careful arrangement. Nothing about this particular instruction differed in its basic institutional shape from countless similar instructions the Sisterhood had issued to countless other sisters across the breeding index's long history. It was simply the latest careful adjustment in a project already centuries deep, delivered with the same calm institutional confidence that had characterized the entire program since its earliest founding. The blind spot embedded within that confidence, largely invisible even to the sisterhood's own most senior leadership at the time, was the assumption that an individual woman, however thoroughly trained, however deeply loyal to the sisterhood that had shaped her entire adult life, would ultimately follow an instruction that ran directly against the specific, personal love she had developed for the particular man she had actually been sent to serve. The breeding index had, across its long history, accounted for genetic variables with extraordinary sophistication, tracking traits and temperaments, and prescient sensitivity with a rigor few other institutions across the Imperium had ever matched in the specific domain of applied human genetics. What it had never fully accounted for, because no genetic calculation could ever fully account for it, was the specific, irreducible unpredictability of an individual human heart making its own choice under its own particular, personal circumstances, regardless of how thoroughly that heart's owner had been trained to subordinate personal feeling to institutional necessity. This history wants to be clear, evidence that Bene Gesserit training somehow failed in Jessica's specific case. It is evidence of something considerably more fundamental. That any plan built around the cooperation of countless individual human choices carries, embedded permanently within its own structure, exactly this kind of irreducible risk. A risk no amount of additional training or additional institutional pressure could ever fully eliminate without eliminating the very humanity the plan depended upon in the first place. The sisterhood's own genetic sophistication, considerable as it genuinely was, could chart probability with impressive accuracy across large populations and long timescales. It could not guarantee any single individual outcome, and the entire architecture of the breeding index rested, ultimately, on exactly this kind of individual outcome occurring reliably enough, generation after generation, to eventually reach its intended genetic destination. Jessica's own particular chapter within this vast project would prove, in the most consequential way imaginable, exactly how wide the gap between statistical probability and individual reality could actually become. It is worth pausing here to consider just how much patient human effort the breeding index actually required across its many generations of operation. Entire careers spent tracking genealogies, entire lifetimes devoted to arranging introductions and encouraging particular courtships. All of it conducted with a discretion so careful that most of the noble families involved never once suspected the true, patient genetic logic quietly shaping their own household's most consequential unions. This was labor measured not in years, but in centuries, an unbroken chain of careful institutional attention, passed from one generation of sisters to the next. Each new custodian of the project, inheriting genealogies and calculations she herself had played no part in originally compiling. And yet for all this labor, for all this accumulated genetic sophistication, the project's ultimate success still depended, at every single generation along its long chain, on individual people actually marrying who the sisterhood hoped they would marry, actually bearing the children the sisterhood hoped they would bear, actually raising those children in roughly the direction the sisterhood's careful calculations assumed. Every single one of these steps represented its own small point of possible deviation, its own small opportunity for an individual human choice to quietly diverge from the institutional plan resting, invisibly, upon it. Multiplied across the many generations the full project actually required, this accumulated uncertainty grew considerably larger than the sisterhood's own confident public reputation ever fully acknowledged. A hidden fragility resting beneath centuries of otherwise genuinely impressive patient planning. The genetic traits the breeding index actually tracked extended well beyond simple prescient sensitivity. encompassing physical resilience, particular patterns of temperament, and a range of subtler qualities the sisterhood's own accumulated centuries of observation had identified as relevant to producing a stable, capable Kwisatz Haderach candidate. This breadth of tracked traits reflected genuine scientific sophistication, an institution attempting to model human genetic inheritance with a rigor few other organizations throughout the Imperium had ever seriously attempted across comparable timescales. And yet this same breadth introduced its own additional layer of uncertainty into the project's ultimate outcome, since predicting how so many distinct traits might combine and express themselves across any single individual required assumptions about genetic interaction that, however carefully reasoned, still remained fundamentally probabilistic rather than certain. The breeding index could narrow the range of likely outcomes considerably. It could never actually guarantee which specific combination of inherited qualities any single child would ultimately display, a limitation this history has already begun tracing and will continue tracing across the specific chapters still ahead. It is also worth noting that the breeding index's own internal records grew considerably more complex with each passing generation. As new genetic data accumulated alongside older, sometimes contradictory observations, requiring successive generations of sisters to continually reconcile and reinterpret evidence their predecessors had gathered under somewhat different theoretical assumptions. The breeding index's own physical records, maintained across countless generations in whatever secure form the sisterhood's own evolving technology allowed, represented themselves a considerable institutional achievement. An unbroken chain of genealogical documentation few other organizations throughout the Imperium's long history had ever attempted to sustain across a comparable number of generations. This layered complexity itself, patiently managed across generations, stands as its own quiet monument to sustained institutional care. Up next, in Chapter 4, Jessica's assignment will uncover the specific instruction given to Lady Jessica at Caladan and the considerable institutional confidence surrounding it. Lady Jessica arrived at Caladan already carrying, in the most literal sense, a specific institutional purpose the sisterhood had assigned her years before she ever met Duke Leto Atreides in person. Trained from earliest childhood within the sisterhood's own demanding schools, Jessica had absorbed every dimension of Bene Gesserit discipline, the physical mastery of Prana Bindu, the persuasive power of the voice, the careful, patient philosophy underlying the entire order's approach to influence and control. All of it building toward a woman the sisterhood trusted completely to execute a genetic assignment of considerable long-term importance. The instruction itself was specific and, within the breeding index's own careful internal logic, entirely reasonable. Jessica was to become Duke Leto's consort, bear him a daughter, and ensure that daughter's eventual marriage to a Harkonnen heir would complete a genetic convergence the sisterhood's own accumulated calculations had identified as the final necessary step toward producing the Kwisatz Haderach, roughly one generation later than what would actually occur. Once Jessica made her own considerably more personal choice, a son, by explicit sisterhood instruction, was not merely unnecessary to this particular plan, but actively contrary to it, introducing a male heir whose own genetic inheritance would complicate rather than complete the careful convergence the index had spent so many generations patiently arranging. Jessica understood this instruction with complete clarity. Her training left no room for confusion about what the sisterhood expected of her, nor about the considerable institutional weight resting behind that expectation. She had been raised within an order that valued discipline above nearly everything else, an order whose entire philosophy rested on the premise that personal feeling, however genuine, existed to be carefully managed and subordinated to larger, more considered institutional purpose whenever the two came into meaningful conflict. And yet, something else had also grown within Jessica across her years at Caladan. Something the sisterhood's own careful training had never fully anticipated needing to guard against in her specific case. A genuine, deepening love for Duke Leto himself. And beyond that, an equally genuine longing to give him specifically the son he had. In private moments away from any formal political consideration, expressed his own quiet wish to have. This was not, Jessica's own later reflection suggests, a calculated act of rebellion undertaken with any clear understanding of its eventual consequence. It was something considerably more human than that. A woman genuinely torn between the discipline that had shaped her entire life and a love that had grown, gradually and almost without her own full awareness, into something powerful enough to eventually override that discipline entirely. The sisterhood's own leadership, reviewing Jessica's particular assignment and her particular temperament before dispatching her to Caladan, had judged her fully capable of executing the instruction reliably. This judgment was not unreasonable given everything the sisterhood actually knew about her. Her considerable natural talent, her thorough training, her demonstrated loyalty across years of prior service. What the judgment could not fully account for, because no institutional evaluation conducted before the fact could ever fully account for it, was exactly how Jessica's own particular heart would eventually respond to years of genuine intimacy with a genuinely admirable man she had originally been sent to observe and serve in a considerably more detached, professional capacity. This is precisely the blind spot this history traced in the chapter immediately preceding this one, made suddenly, vividly concrete in a single specific woman's single specific life. The breeding index could calculate genetic probability with remarkable sophistication across a vast statistical population. It could not calculate, with anything approaching the same reliability, exactly how one particular trained sister would resolve the tension between her institutional duty and her own developing personal feeling, because that resolution depended on factors no genetic chart could ever fully capture. The specific texture of a specific relationship, the specific quality of a specific man's character, the specific way genuine partnership can gradually reshape even the most thoroughly disciplined person's own private priorities. The sisterhood's confidence in Jessica, considerable and genuinely well-founded by every external measure available to them at the time, rested on an assumption this entire history exists to complicate, that sufficiently thorough training could reliably guarantee sufficiently predictable behavior, even in circumstances the training's original architects had never precisely anticipated. Jessica's own life, and the entire cascade of consequence that would eventually follow from the choice she was quietly already beginning to consider, would prove, in the most dramatic and most consequential way the sisterhood's long history had ever produced, exactly how unreliable that particular assumption actually was. It is worth remembering, too, that Jessica did not arrive at Caladan as some blank instrument awaiting only her institutional purpose. She arrived as a fully formed young woman, shaped by years of rigorous sisterhood education, certainly, but also possessing her own particular temperament, her own particular capacity for genuine affection, her own particular way of experiencing the world that no training program, however thorough, could ever fully standardize away. The sisterhood trained its sisters to master emotion rather than eliminate it entirely, and this distinction matters considerably to understanding what eventually happened between Jessica and Leto. Because mastery of an emotion is never quite the same thing as its absence, and a feeling carefully managed for years can still, given the right circumstances and sufficient time, gradually grow into something a person finds she can no longer manage in quite the way her training once assumed she reliably could. Duke Leto himself, for his own part, treated Jessica with a genuine respect and genuine partnership that many other noblemen receiving a Bene Gesserit consort might not have offered so freely, valuing her counsel and her company in ways that went considerably beyond the purely political arrangement their union had technically begun as. This genuine mutual regard, developing steadily across their years together at Caladan, created exactly the kind of fertile emotional ground in which Jessica's eventual quiet defiance could take root, not because Leto ever asked her to defy her own order, but simply because a partnership this genuine naturally deepened the very attachment the sisterhood's original careful calculation had never fully waded into its own confident institutional planning. It is worth remembering, too, the particular quality of isolation Jessica experienced during her years at Caladan, distant from the wider sisterhood community that had raised and trained her, surrounded instead by Atreides' household staff and the specific, considerable personality of Duke Leto himself. This physical and social distance from her own order's daily institutional life created exactly the kind of conditions under which personal loyalty and personal affection could grow considerably stronger relative to institutional loyalty than the sisterhood's own careful planning had perhaps fully anticipated when originally assigning her to this particular post. Sisters dispatched to serve within noble households across the Imperium routinely experienced some version of this same tension, balancing genuine personal relationship against institutional purpose, and the sisterhood's own training generally proved sufficient to manage this tension reliably across countless other assignments throughout their long history. Jessica's own particular case would prove, in the end, the exception that revealed just how much this general reliability actually depended on circumstances the sisterhood could not fully control or fully anticipate in advance. It is worth remembering, too, that many other sisters serving in comparable positions across the Imperium's many noble households navigated similarly genuine personal attachments without ultimately choosing to defy their own explicit institutional instructions. A reminder that Jessica's particular choice, however consequential, reflected her own specific character and specific circumstance rather than any inevitable failure built into the sisterhood's general approach to this kind of assignment. Duke Leto's own household staff, observing Jessica and Leto's relationship develop across these years, later offered fragments of testimony suggesting the couple's bond appeared genuinely deep even by the ordinary standards of noble marriage. A detail this history includes not to romanticize what followed, but simply to record what those closest to the situation actually observed at the time. These same observers noted, too, a growing tenderness in how Jessica spoke of her own future, small details that, viewed only afterward, seemed to quietly foreshadow the choice she would eventually make. Up next in Chapter 5, The Choice That Broke the Plan, we'll uncover exactly what Jessica ultimately chose, and the considerable institutional shock that followed once the sisterhood finally learned of it. When Jessica ultimately made her choice, she made it quietly, without the kind of dramatic confrontation that might have alerted the wider sisterhood leadership before the decision had already, irreversibly, taken effect within her own body. There was no formal announcement, no petition for permission the sisterhood might have simply denied. There was only a private, personal decision, carried entirely within herself, to conceive and bear Duke Leto a son rather than the daughter her explicit instructions had required. A decision Jessica understood clearly violated the specific genetic assignment the sisterhood had given her, and one she made anyway, out of love for Leto and out of her own private hope that this particular defiance might, in some way, she could not fully articulate even to herself, still ultimately serve some greater good. The mechanics of this choice, insofar as later accounts and the sisterhood's own subsequent genetic analysis allow reconstruction, involved Jessica's own considerable training in the biological control every fully trained sister possessed. The same physiological mastery that allowed Reverend Mothers to transmute poison during their own transformative ordeal applied here to a considerably more intimate, considerably more consequential biological choice, determining, through her own internal discipline, that the child she carried would be male rather than female. This single act, private and personal, in its immediate execution, carried consequence that would eventually reshape the entire trajectory of the Breeding Index's centuries-long project. A son meant a Kwisatz Haderach candidate, arriving roughly one full generation earlier than the sisterhood's own careful calculations had anticipated. Born into circumstances the wider genetic program had never specifically prepared for. Raised by a mother whose own considerable sisterhood training would inevitably shape the child in ways the sisterhood's original, carefully sequenced plan had never quite intended to allow this particular generation. Jessica's own reasoning, in the fragments of later reflection that survive across various accounts, suggests she genuinely believed, at least in part, that a male heir might actually serve the sisterhood's underlying genetic goal even more directly than the original plan had intended, essentially attempting to deliver the Kwisatz Haderach herself rather than waiting for her own daughter's eventual marriage to complete the convergence a full generation later. This was not, in other words, purely an act of romantic rebellion disconnected from any institutional consideration. It was something considerably more complicated. A woman attempting to honor both her personal love and her own understanding of the sisterhood's larger genetic purpose simultaneously, trusting her own judgment over the specific instruction she had actually been given. Whatever Jessica's own internal reasoning, the practical consequence for the wider sisterhood proved immediate and considerable once her choice eventually became known. An entire genetic project built across centuries of patient, careful sequencing had just been unilaterally altered by a single sister's personal decision, introducing a variable the breeding index's careful calculations had never specifically accounted for at this particular point in the timeline. The sisterhood's leadership, upon learning what Jessica had done, faced a genuinely uncomfortable realization that their entire elaborate system of careful genetic management depended, at its most fundamental level, on individual trained women actually following individual specific instructions, and that this dependency contained exactly the kind of irreducible human risk no amount of institutional sophistication could ever fully eliminate. This moment deserves particular attention within this history because it represents, in the clearest possible terms, the exact instant where the sisterhood's careful, patient plans stopped being something they controlled and became, instead, something they were now simply reacting to. Every subsequent chapter in this account traces consequences flowing, directly or indirectly, from this single private choice, made quietly by one woman on one quiet world, entirely outside any formal sisterhood deliberation or approval. There is something genuinely worth sitting with in this particular turning point, a reminder that even the most sophisticated, most patient institutional planning ultimately depends on individual human beings choosing, moment to moment, to actually execute that planning as intended, and that this dependency, however carefully managed through training and discipline and institutional loyalty, can never be made entirely reliable, because the individual human beings involved remain, however thoroughly trained, still fundamentally capable of choosing otherwise when love or conviction or simple personal longing proves strong enough to override even years of careful institutional formation. There is a particular kind of courage worth naming in what Jessica actually did. whatever judgment history eventually renders on its considerable consequence. She acted entirely alone, without any sisterhood confidante to consult, without any guarantee that her private reasoning about ultimately serving the larger genetic project would prove correct, carrying the full weight of a decision she knew violated her explicit institutional instruction, and knew, too, she would eventually need to answer for once its consequence became apparent to the wider sisterhood leadership. This was not defiance undertaken lightly or without genuine personal risk. And this history wants to resist any simple framing that reduces her choice to either pure romantic rebellion or pure calculated miscalculation. What makes Jessica's choice so central to this account is precisely how ordinary its underlying human logic actually was, even as its institutional consequence proved genuinely extraordinary. She loved a man, and she wanted, in the most human and most understandable way imaginable, to give him something he had quietly told her he wished for. That this same ordinary human wish happened to intersect with one of the most consequential genetic projects in the recorded history of the Imperium says considerably less about Jessica's own particular failing, and considerably more about the fundamental vulnerability embedded in any plan, however sophisticated, that ultimately depends on ordinary human hearts continuing to behave exactly as careful institutional calculation assumes they always will. The specific biological mechanism Jessica used to determine her child's sex deserves brief further explanation here, since it illustrates just how thoroughly Bene Gesserit training had already given individual sisters capability considerably beyond what the wider Imperium generally understood ordinary human biology to allow. This same capability, so useful in service of the sisterhood's own careful genetic planning across countless other pregnancies throughout their long history, proved in Jessica's specific case the very tool that allowed her personal choice to override her explicit institutional instruction so completely and so irreversibly. There is something worth sitting with in this particular irony, that the sisterhood's own considerable technical sophistication, developed and refined across centuries specifically to serve their genetic project's success, ultimately provided the precise mechanism through which that same project's careful sequence could be so thoroughly and so personally redirected by a single trained woman's own private choice. It is worth noting, too, that Jessica's choice was not made in a single instant, but rather represented the culmination of a private, ongoing internal deliberation stretched across the later months of her pregnancy, weighing her love for Leto and her own private hopes against everything her sisterhood training had spent years carefully instilling in her regarding institutional duty. This extended internal process, invisible to everyone around her including Leto himself, meant the eventual choice, however irreversible in its consequence, emerged from genuine, sustained reflection rather than any single impulsive moment of romantic defiance. Later sisterhood historians, reviewing this particular episode across subsequent generations, tended to treat Jessica's choice as a genuine turning point in their own institutional self-understanding, a case study returned to repeatedly whenever the order needed to examine the practical limits of even their most careful, most thorough training against the irreducible unpredictability of genuine, individual human love. Up next in Chapter 6, the Kwisatz Haderach, One Generation Too Soon, will uncover exactly why Paul's early arrival proved so genuinely alarming to the sisterhood's own careful leadership. The moment the wider sisterhood leadership fully grasped what Jessica's choice actually meant, their reaction combined genuine institutional alarm with a considerably more complicated undercurrent of professional fascination. An entire genetic program's careful timeline suddenly compressed by a full generation, producing a Kwisatz Haderach candidate whose early arrival meant he would grow up without the additional decades of careful, sequenced preparation the sisterhood's original plan had specifically built in to manage exactly this kind of extraordinary genetic outcome safely. The specific danger this compressed timeline created deserves careful explanation, because it illustrates precisely why the sisterhood valued control so highly in the first place, not simply as an expression of institutional pride, but as a genuine safety mechanism protecting against outcomes their own careful genetic theory suggested could prove catastrophically dangerous if allowed to develop without adequate oversight. A Kwisatz Haderach, capable of accessing both male and female ancestral memory and, in the sisterhood's own theoretical framework, capable of perceiving probability and consequence across scales no ordinary human mind could reliably process, represented an extraordinary concentration of capability that the sisterhood's entire careful, patient timeline had been specifically designed to introduce gradually, with sufficient institutional support and sufficient additional preparation to help such a figure integrate his own extraordinary capability safely, without being overwhelmed or corrupted by power considerably beyond what any single human mind had previously needed to manage. Paul's early arrival meant none of this additional preparation would actually exist when his own capability eventually began to manifest. He would grow up on Caladan, and later at considerably more dangerous Arrakis. Without the generation of additional sisterhood infrastructure the original plan had assumed would already be in place by the time a Kwisatz Haderach candidate actually appeared. The sisterhood, in other words, now found themselves managing an outcome their own careful theory suggested was potentially extremely dangerous, using only the tools and preparation appropriate to a considerably more gradual arrival that Jessica's choice had simply rendered obsolete. Mohiam, dispatched specifically to formally evaluate young Paul once his unusual capability became apparent even at a remarkably young age, approached her assignment with exactly this compressed timeline weighing heavily on her own considerable professional judgment. Her subsequent Gom Jabbar testing, examined in the chapter immediately following this one, represented the sisterhood's first direct, formal attempt to assess exactly how much genuine danger this early, unplanned arrival actually posed, and exactly how much genuine capability the boy in front of her actually possessed. What makes this entire episode so central to this history's larger argument is how clearly it demonstrates the specific mechanism by which the sisterhood's control actually eroded, not through any single dramatic external attack on their institutional authority, but through the accumulating consequence of their own careful genetic project succeeding, in its narrowest biological sense, considerably faster than their own institutional capacity to manage that success safely could actually keep pace with. The breeding index worked. It simply worked on a timeline the sisterhood themselves had not chosen and could not, once Jessica's private decision had already taken irreversible biological effect, meaningfully slow back down to the pace their original planning had assumed would be available. This particular kind of institutional problem, succeeding too quickly rather than failing outright, rarely receives the same careful attention that outright failure typically attracts. And yet, this history suggests it deserves considerably more attention than it usually receives, because it illustrates a genuinely important truth about any sufficiently ambitious long-term project, that success itself can generate exactly the kind of unmanageable consequence careful planners spend years trying to guard against through gradual, sequenced implementation, precisely because success achieved outside the intended sequence arrives without the supporting infrastructure that sequence was actually designed to provide. The sisterhood now faced Paul Atreides not as a carefully anticipated culmination of centuries of patient work, arriving exactly when and how their own theory suggested he safely could, but as an urgent, unplanned present reality requiring immediate, improvised management using tools built for an entirely different, considerably more gradual timeline. Everything that followed, the testing, the careful monitoring, the growing alarm as Paul's capability continued exceeding even generous expectations, flowed directly from this fundamental mismatch between what the Sisterhood's plan had actually produced and what their institutional preparation had actually anticipated needing to manage. It is worth considering, too, exactly what additional preparation the Sisterhood's original, uncompressed timeline would actually have provided, had Jessica's choice not accelerated Paul's arrival by a full generation. Their careful design assumed considerably more time to establish supporting infrastructure around any eventual Kwisatz Haderach candidate. Additional trained sisters positioned to offer guidance. Additional careful cultivation of the specific political and religious circumstances that might allow such a figure to develop his own extraordinary capability under conditions the Sisterhood could still meaningfully monitor and, where necessary, gently correct. None of this additional scaffolding existed when Paul actually needed it, not because the Sisterhood had failed to design it, but because the timeline that would have allowed its construction had already, irreversibly, been compressed by a full generation before anyone in Sisterhood leadership even fully understood what Jessica had done. This particular kind of institutional problem, being technically correct in one's underlying theory while catastrophically unprepared for the actual timing of that theory's realization, deserves considerably more attention than it typically receives in discussions of institutional failure, because it reveals something genuinely important about the limits of even the most sophisticated long-term planning. A plan can be entirely sound in its fundamental design and still fail to produce its intended outcome safely, simply because the specific sequence and specific timing that safety actually depended upon never had the chance to unfold as originally intended. The Sisterhood's own internal deliberation, once Jessica's choice and its full consequence became clear to the wider leadership, reportedly grew genuinely contentious, some senior Reverend mothers arguing for immediate, direct intervention to somehow manage or correct the situation, others counseling patient, careful observation, given how little practical alternative actually remained available to them at this point. This internal disagreement itself reveals something worth noting. An institution normally characterized by unified, confident decision-making suddenly divided over how best to respond to a crisis their own careful planning had never actually anticipated needing to address. Ultimately, the Sisterhood settled on a strategy of careful monitoring rather than direct intervention, recognizing, however reluctantly, that meaningful direct control over Paul's development had already largely slipped beyond their reach the moment Jessica's private choice had taken irreversible biological effect years earlier. This particular episode also offers a useful early illustration of a pattern that would recur throughout the remainder of this history. The Sisterhood's careful theoretical understanding of danger consistently outpacing their actual practical capacity to prevent that danger from unfolding. They understood, with genuine sophistication, exactly what an early, uncontrolled Kwisatz Haderach arrival might mean. Understanding the danger clearly and possessing the practical means to actually prevent it turned out, again and again across this account, to be two considerably different things. The Sisterhood's own eventual acceptance of this compressed, unmanageable timeline required a considerable psychological adjustment from an institution accustomed to operating according to its own carefully chosen schedule, forcing senior leadership to develop entirely new habits of reactive rather than proactive decision-making that would, in various forms, characterize much of their institutional posture for generations still to come. This particular gap between theoretical readiness and practical readiness would recur throughout the remainder of Paul's own life. And throughout the remainder of this history, an institution repeatedly correct in its underlying analysis, while repeatedly caught without sufficient time or sufficient resource to actually act on that analysis before events had already moved decisively beyond them. Up next in Chapter 7, the Gom Jabbar and the First Warning Sign, we'll uncover Mohiam's formal testing of young Paul, and exactly what that dangerous trial actually revealed about how little control the sisterhood truly retained. Gaius Helen Mohiam arrived at Caledon carrying the full institutional weight of the sisterhood's growing concern. Tasked with formally testing young Paul Atreides using the Gom Jabbar, a poisoned needle held against the subject's neck throughout a trial designed to determine whether he possessed genuine human self-mastery or remained, in the sisterhood's own careful terminology, merely an animal governed by instinct, incapable of overriding pain and fear through conscious, disciplined will. The trial required Paul to hold his hand inside a small box, generating excruciating nerve pain, while Mohiam stood ready to kill him instantly should he withdraw it before the test concluded. A combination of genuine agony and genuine mortal stakes that few subjects at any age could reliably endure. Paul endured the entire ordeal without withdrawing his hand, drawing on the litany against fear his mother had taught him, despite this instruction violating strict sisterhood protocol, reserving such teaching for properly trained sisters rather than for a young boy whose formal education, by the sisterhood's own original design, should never have included this particular discipline at all. His success proved, beyond any doubt available to Mohiam's own considerable expertise, that Paul possessed self-mastery considerably exceeding what most adults, let alone a boy his age, could typically demonstrate. This history wants to name something specific about this famous testing that often goes unremarked in more conventional retellings. That the test itself represented, in its deepest institutional sense, an admission of exactly how little the sisterhood actually knew about what they were now dealing with. A properly sequenced Kwisatz Haderach candidate, arriving on the sisterhood's own original timeline, would have grown up within considerably more extensive institutional monitoring, his capability tracked and assessed gradually across years of careful, ongoing observation, rather than compressed into a single dramatic trial conducted under considerable urgency once his unusual nature had already become impossible to ignore. Mohiam's own reaction to Paul's successful endurance, combining genuine professional alarm with a grudging, considerable respect for what she had personally witnessed, reveals a woman confronting evidence that directly contradicted the sisterhood's own careful assumptions about how much time remained before this particular candidate's full capability would need to be managed. The very fact that a formal, dangerous trial was necessary at all, rather than simply confirming what years of careful prior observation had already gradually established, testifies to exactly the kind of improvised, reactive institutional posture this history has been tracing since Jessica's original choice first compressed the entire timeline. Jessica's own teaching of the litany to Paul, the specific violation of protocol that ultimately allowed him to survive the test at all, deserves particular attention here as well, because it represents yet another instance of individual human choice quietly overriding official sisterhood instruction. Jessica, watching from a nearby doorway as her son faced genuine mortal danger, had already once chosen personal love over institutional obedience when she conceived him in the first place. Her decision to teach him forbidden sisterhood discipline represented a second, smaller instance of exactly the same underlying pattern. A mother's practical love for her specific child overriding an institutional rule designed for circumstances that had never actually anticipated a boy this young facing this particular trial this early in his own life. The considerable irony embedded within this entire episode, examined honestly, is that Paul survived the very test designed partly to assess the danger created by his own early, uncontrolled arrival, precisely because his mother, once again, quietly broke sisterhood protocol to help him. Meaning, the test's successful outcome depended, in some genuine sense, on exactly the same pattern of individual defiance the sisterhood's own careful institutional design had always assumed it could reliably prevent through sufficiently thorough training. Mohiam's report following the testing set into motion increasingly urgent sisterhood attention toward monitoring and, where genuinely possible, influencing Paul's trajectory going forward. But this attention, however increased, remained fundamentally reactive in character. The sisterhood now working to manage a situation already well beyond the careful, gradual sequence their original planning had assumed would still be available to them, chasing a compressed timeline they themselves had never actually chosen, and could not, at this point, meaningfully reverse. It is worth dwelling, too, on what this particular trial reveals about the peculiar position Mohiam herself occupied throughout this entire unfolding crisis. She had spent her own considerable career as one of the sisterhood's most trusted and most capable Reverend Mothers, entrusted with exactly the kind of delicate, high-stakes evaluation that required both formidable technical skill and formidable personal judgment. And yet, even her own considerable expertise could offer the wider sisterhood leadership only a single data point, gathered under conditions of genuine urgency, rather than the careful, extended observation their original timeline had always assumed would be available. She tested a boy she had never previously closely observed, working from second-hand reports and her own brief, intense encounter with him, and delivered a verdict the entire sisterhood leadership would need to act upon, despite knowing, better than anyone, how much genuine uncertainty still remained beneath even her own considerable professional confidence. This is precisely the condition this history has been describing since its opening chapter. An institution accustomed to patient, extended observation, suddenly forced into rapid, high-consequence judgment, working with considerably less complete information than their traditional methods had always assumed they would eventually possess before any decision of this magnitude actually needed to be made. The specific physiological demands the Gom-Jabbar testing placed on a subject deserve further attention here, because they illustrate exactly why the sisterhood considered this particular trial such a reliable, if genuinely brutal, measure of authentic self-mastery. The pain generated by the testing box operated directly on the nervous system, bypassing any possibility of simple physical tolerance or gradual acclimation, meaning a subject's endurance depended entirely on genuine conscious discipline, rather than on any lesser form of simple physical toughness that training alone, without the specific psychological technique the litany provided, could ever reliably produce. Paul's success under these exact conditions offered Mohiam considerably more reliable evidence of his underlying capability than any less demanding test could have provided, even as the very necessity of conducting such an extreme trial on so young a subject revealed, once again, exactly how far outside their careful original planning the sisterhood now found themselves operating. It is worth remembering, too, that Paul's success in this trial, however remarkable, still left the sisterhood facing considerable remaining uncertainty about his full eventual capability. Surviving the Gom-Jabbar confirmed genuine self-mastery. It did not, on its own, reveal the full scope of what Paul might eventually become capable of as his own prescient ability continued developing. Meaning, the sisterhood's alarm following this testing represented only the beginning of a much longer, much more sustained period of anxious observation still to come. Mohiam herself would go on to play a continuing role in Paul's later life. Her own complicated relationship with him shaped permanently by this first dramatic encounter. A reminder that even the sisterhood's most consequential formal trials often produced lasting personal relationships that outran whatever narrow institutional purpose the trial itself had originally been designed to serve. Mohiam carried the memory of that particular afternoon for the remainder of her own long life, later describing it in fragments to trusted colleagues as the single moment she first understood, in her own gut rather than merely in careful sisterhood theory, exactly how far beyond their careful timeline this specific candidate had already grown. Up next in Chapter 8, Paul's education beyond the curriculum, we'll uncover exactly how much additional sisterhood knowledge Jessica continued passing to her son, and how thoroughly this quietly undermined whatever careful institutional control the sisterhood still believed themselves to hold. Jessica's teaching of the litany against fear, examined in the previous chapter, was not an isolated instance of a mother bending institutional rules for her son. It represented, this history argues, the visible edge of something considerably more sustained and considerably more consequential. A mother who had already once chosen personal conviction over explicit sisterhood instruction continuing across Paul's entire childhood to make similar quiet choices about exactly what her extraordinary son actually needed to know, regardless of whether the wider sisterhood leadership had formally authorized any particular piece of that knowledge. Paul's education, viewed in full, extended considerably beyond what any standard Bene Gesserit curriculum, even one specifically adapted for an unusually promising male candidate, would normally have included at his particular age. Jessica taught him fragments of sisterhood physical discipline, elements of the voice, techniques of observation and deduction, the order typically reserved for sisters considerably further along in their own extensive formal training. Each individual lesson, considered in isolation, might have seemed a relatively small departure from strict protocol, a mother sharing useful knowledge with a clearly gifted child. Considered together, across the accumulated span of Paul's entire childhood and adolescence, they represent a pattern of sustained, deliberate deviation from the careful, sequenced education the sisterhood's own institutional design assumed would govern any Kwisatz Haderach candidate's development. This matters enormously to the larger argument this history is tracing, because institutional control depends fundamentally on institutions actually controlling the information and capability available to the people operating within their sphere of influence. A sisterhood that believed it was carefully managing Paul's development according to its own considered institutional judgment was, in practical reality, managing a version of Paul considerably less complete than the version actually developing under Jessica's own independent, parallel curriculum, delivered quietly, at home, entirely outside any formal sisterhood oversight or approval. Paul's own tutors, beyond his mother, including the Mentat Tufir Hawat and the weapons master Gurney Halleck and the swordmaster Duncan Idaho, contributed their own considerable expertise to an education that, taken as a complete whole, produced a young man extraordinarily capable across an unusually wide range of disciplines, political, martial, and sisterhood adjacent, all at once, a combination no single institution, including the Bene Gesserit themselves, had actually designed or fully anticipated. Paul was, in the most literal sense, the product of several overlapping educational projects operating simultaneously, only one of which the sisterhood had any genuine oversight over. And even that oversight, as this chapter has traced, proved considerably less complete than the sisterhood themselves likely assumed. The eventual consequence of this, compounded, uncontrolled education would become fully apparent only later, once Paul's capability had grown considerably beyond what any single observer, sisterhood or otherwise, could have fully anticipated from any individual piece of his unusually varied training. But the underlying pattern was already firmly established well before Paul ever set foot on Arrakis. A young man being shaped by multiple independent forces, his mother's own private judgment prominent among them. In ways the Sisterhood's own careful institutional planning had simply never accounted for, and could not, at this point, meaningfully redirect back toward anything resembling their original intended sequence. There is a particular irony worth naming here directly, that an institution renowned throughout the Imperium for its extraordinary patience and extraordinary control over information found itself in the case of its own single most consequential genetic project, working with considerably less complete information than the boy's own mother possessed about what he had actually learned and what he had actually become capable of. Control, this history keeps returning to, requires more than careful planning. It requires reliable knowledge of what is actually occurring on the ground, and by the time Paul reached adolescence, the Sisterhood's own knowledge of their most important genetic candidate had already grown considerably less reliable than their institutional confidence assumed. Consider, too, how differently Paul's education might have unfolded had Jessica remained strictly within the bounds of her own official Sisterhood instruction. A more conventionally raised Kwisatz Haderach candidate, educated purely according to whatever curriculum the Sisterhood's original, uncompressed timeline had actually designed, would have grown up considerably more thoroughly monitored, considerably more predictable in his own eventual capability, and considerably easier for the Sisterhood to track and, where necessary, gently redirect. The actual Paul who emerged from Jessica's considerably more independent parenting proved something else entirely. Extraordinarily capable, certainly, but capable in ways that had developed largely outside any single institution's full awareness. A young man whose true extent of ability the Sisterhood themselves would spend years afterwards struggling to fully understand, let alone reliably predict. This gap between institutional assumption and actual developing reality would prove, across the chapters immediately following this one, considerably more consequential than anyone observing Paul's childhood at Caladan could have reasonably anticipated at the time. Thufir Hawat's own contribution to Paul's unusually comprehensive education deserves particular mention here, since mentat training, focused on rigorous logical analysis and strategic reasoning, complemented Jessica's Bene Gesserit instruction in ways that produced a genuinely unusual combination of capability in a single young man. Where Sisterhood training emphasized physical and psychological mastery, mentat training emphasized pure analytical reasoning, and Paul's exposure to both traditions simultaneously, entirely outside any single institution's coordinated design, produced a mind equipped with tools no careful Sisterhood curriculum, however thorough, would have specifically intended to combine in quite this particular way. This convergence of independent educational traditions, each contributing its own considerable strength without any single overseeing institution actually coordinating the combination, represents its own small but significant instance of exactly the pattern this history has been tracing since its opening chapter. Capability accumulating through forces considerably beyond what any single careful planner could have fully anticipated or fully controlled. Duncan Idaho's own considerable contribution to Paul's education deserves mention here as well, teaching swordsmanship and combat discipline shaped by his own extensive experience serving House Atreides across many prior years. A tradition of loyalty and martial skill entirely separate from anything Bene Gesserit or mentat training specifically provided. Duncan's own eventual death defending Paul and Jessica's escape from Arrakis would later become, through complicated circumstances this history's other companion accounts examine in fuller detail, its own strange thread connecting back into the wider Atreides story across generations still to come. Gurney Halleck's contribution, weapons mastery, and a particular kind of gruff, genuine affection. Rounded out an education that drew from at least 4 distinct traditions simultaneously. Bene Gesserit, Mentat, Swordmaster, and Atreides household loyalty itself, none of them coordinated by any single overseeing authority, each contributing its own considerable strength to a young man whose eventual capability would exceed what any single one of these traditions, applied alone, could have possibly produced. The cumulative effect of drawing simultaneously on so many distinct traditions gave Paul a genuinely unusual cognitive flexibility. The ability to shift fluidly between Mentat logical analysis, Bene Gesserit physical and psychological discipline, and Swordmaster combat instinct, depending on whatever a given situation actually demanded. A versatility none of his individual teachers could have specifically anticipated producing when each contributed their own separate piece to his overall education. Paul's tutors themselves, watching their remarkably capable student absorb each distinct discipline with unusual speed, sometimes remarked privately on how thoroughly he seemed to synthesize their separate lessons into something considerably more coherent than any single one of them had specifically intended to teach, an early sign of the extraordinary integrative capability that would define his later development. Up next in Chapter 9, Kaladin falls, and so does the timeline, we'll uncover how House Atreides' sudden destruction shattered whatever remaining sequence the Sisterhood's careful planning still assumed it retained. Whatever remaining sense of manageable sequence the Sisterhood still believed they retained over Paul's development collapsed entirely the night House Harkonnen, in coordination with Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV, launched their devastating surprise assault against House Atreides on Arrakis. Duke Leto was killed. The Atreides household guard, including many of the very men who had contributed to Paul's own unusually thorough education, was scattered or destroyed. Jessica and Paul fled into the deep desert with almost nothing beyond what they could carry. Their entire carefully structured existence obliterated within a single catastrophic night that no Sisterhood calculation, however sophisticated, had specifically anticipated occurring exactly when and how it actually did. This history wants to be careful here, not to suggest the Sisterhood was entirely blind to the political dangers surrounding House Atreides. Bene Gesserit intelligence understood, in general terms, that the Harkonnen and Atreides households maintained a bitter, long-standing rivalry, and that the Emperor's own relationship with Duke Leto carried genuine political tension beneath its careful public courtesy. What the Sisterhood's careful planning had not specifically built into its own timeline was the precise moment this general political danger would actually erupt into open, devastating violence. Nor the fact that this violence would strike at exactly the point in Paul's own development when he remained, despite his unusual capability, still considerably short of the full maturity and full preparation the Sisterhood's original sequence had assumed would be available before any such crisis actually arrived. The flight into the desert that followed forced Paul and Jessica into direct, immediate dependence on the Fremen. The very population the Missionaria Protectiva had seeded generations earlier, with the protective prophecy this history will examine directly in the chapter immediately following this one. This dependence occurred not according to any careful Sisterhood plan for gradually introducing Paul to Fremen culture and Fremen belief, but as a desperate, improvised survival response to catastrophic political violence that had already, by the time it actually struck, moved entirely beyond anything the Sisterhood's careful genetic timeline had specifically anticipated managing. Every subsequent chapter in Paul's own extraordinary rise, examined across the remainder of this history, flows directly from this single catastrophic night. The prophecy that would eventually be claimed, the jihad that would eventually follow. The transformation of a promising, unusually capable adolescent into a figure whose eventual influence would reshape the entire Imperium. None of it occurred according to any sequence the Sisterhood's own patient, centuries-long planning had actually designed. It occurred instead as an emergency, improvised response to sudden political catastrophe, shaped considerably more by desperate circumstance than by careful institutional design. This distinction matters enormously to the larger argument this history has been building since its opening chapter. A plan interrupted by sudden catastrophe is not the same thing as a plan that has failed through any particular flaw in its own original design. House Atreides' destruction arrived through ordinary, brutal imperial politics, forces entirely outside the Sisterhood's own genetic and religious planning, and yet its consequence for that planning proved every bit as significant as if the Sisterhood's own careful design had somehow failed on its own specific terms. Control, this history keeps returning to across each successive chapter, requires not simply a good plan, but also a world stable enough to allow that plan to actually unfold according to its own intended sequence. And the Imperium Paul Atreides was born into proved, in the end, considerably less stable and considerably less patient than the Sisterhood's own careful, centuries-long timeline had ever actually required it to be. The Sisterhood, receiving word of House Atreides' destruction and Paul and Jessica's presumed death or disappearance into the deep desert, now faced a genuinely uncomfortable reality that their single most important genetic candidate had vanished entirely beyond any remaining institutional oversight, at precisely the moment his own development had already begun exceeding whatever careful sequence they had originally designed to manage him safely. It is worth considering, too, how thoroughly this single catastrophic night severed whatever remaining thread of careful oversight the Sisterhood still believed themselves to hold. Sisters positioned within the Atreides household, gathering intelligence and maintaining whatever quiet institutional presence the Sisterhood typically arranged around any candidate of genuine genetic significance, found their own careful observation posts destroyed alongside everything else House Atreides had built on Arrakis. Whatever detailed knowledge the Sisterhood had been slowly accumulating about Paul's actual development, his actual capability, his actual state of mind following years of increasingly independent education, effectively vanished into the same chaos that scattered the household guard and claimed Duke Leto's own life. The Sisterhood, in the weeks and months immediately following House Atreides' destruction, found themselves working from fragments, rumor, and considerable uncertainty about whether their single most important genetic candidate had even survived at all. A genuinely humbling position for an institution whose entire reputation rested on the confident, patient accumulation of exactly this kind of detailed, reliable knowledge. The specific circumstances of House Atreides' downfall, involving betrayal from within their own trusted circle, deserve brief additional mention here, since they illustrate how thoroughly political catastrophe of this kind depends on factors entirely outside any genetic or religious institution's typical sphere of careful attention. The Sisterhood's intelligence network, however sophisticated in tracking genetic and religious developments across the Imperium, proved considerably less equipped to anticipate the specific, intimate betrayal that actually triggered House Atreides' sudden collapse. A reminder that institutional expertise in one domain rarely translates automatically into equivalent foresight across every other domain where consequential events might actually originate. This particular blind spot, political and military, rather than genetic or religious in character, compounds the larger pattern this history has been tracing. An institution whose careful centuries of preparation addressed certain kinds of uncertainty with genuine sophistication while remaining considerably more vulnerable to other kinds entirely outside their traditional area of careful expertise. Gurney Halleck's own survival of the initial Harkonnen assault and his eventual reunion with Paul years later deserves brief mention here as well, since it illustrates how thoroughly House Atreides' scattered remnants continued shaping Paul's own trajectory even after the household itself had been formally destroyed. Individual loyal retainers, surviving through their own resourcefulness, entirely outside any sisterhood tracking or sisterhood awareness, would periodically reappear across Paul's subsequent story. Each reappearance another small reminder of how many independent threads were actually shaping his development beyond anything the sisterhood's own careful intelligence gathering could reliably follow. This scattered, resilient loyalty among House Atreides' surviving retainers represents its own quiet counter-narrative to the sisterhood's careful genetic planning, ordinary human bonds of loyalty and service proving, in their own way, every bit as consequential to Paul's eventual rise as any carefully cultivated genetic or religious inheritance. The considerable chaos of that single devastating night also meant the sisterhood's own agents, embedded within neighboring households and neighboring intelligence networks, received wildly inconsistent early reports. Some claiming Paul and Jessica had been killed outright, others suggesting they had escaped into the desert. A genuine fog of uncertainty that persisted for months and left even the sisterhood's most senior leadership working from considerably incomplete information during exactly the period when reliable information mattered most. The sisterhood's own careful post-mortem analysis of House Atreides' fall, conducted many months after the actual event once more reliable information finally became available, revealed just how many small warning signs had gone unnoticed or unheeded across the preceding years. A sobering lesson in how difficult genuine foresight actually proves even for an institution as practiced in careful observation as the sisterhood generally was. The considerable panic and confusion among surviving Atreides household members during the immediate aftermath further complicated the sisterhood's own efforts to establish reliable facts, with different survivors offering genuinely contradictory accounts of exactly what had happened and exactly who among the household had actually survived the initial devastating assault. Up next in Chapter 10, The Missionaries' Trap Turned Against Them, we'll uncover how the very prophecy the sisterhood planted generations earlier among the Fremen became the exact instrument that carried Paul beyond their reach entirely. The Fremen prophecy Paul and Jessica encountered upon reaching Sietch Tabor had been seeded generations earlier by Missionaria Protectiva agents, working carefully to establish exactly the kind of protective legend that might someday allow a stranded sister to secure safety among a population otherwise deeply suspicious of outsiders. The prophecy described a coming figure, born of a Bene Gesserit mother, possessing capabilities the Fremen would recognize through specific, carefully established signs. A Messiah whose arrival Fremen tradition had been quietly, patiently anticipating for longer than any single Fremen alive could actually remember its original planting. This seeded belief was designed, in its original narrow purpose, purely as an emergency safety mechanism, a way for an individual stranded sister to invoke recognized signs and secure protection, rather than facing potentially fatal Fremen suspicion. Nothing about the prophecy's original design anticipated it would eventually be claimed by a genuinely capable young man, actively seeking to build political and religious power, rather than simply seeking narrow personal safety. Nor that Fremen culture would have spent generations developing this seeded belief into something considerably richer, considerably more deeply held, and considerably more politically potent than its original architects had ever specifically intended. Paul's own recognition of the prophecy's existence and his own subsequent, deliberate decision to lean into the signs Fremen tradition already associated with their long-awaited Messiah, represents perhaps the single clearest instance in this entire history of the Sisterhood's own careful design being turned, deliberately and with devastating effectiveness, against their own underlying institutional purpose. The Missionaria Protectiva had built a tool intended for narrow emergency protection. Paul used essentially that same tool to secure not simply his own personal safety, but genuine political and religious authority over an entire population, authority he would eventually leverage to reshape the fate of the whole Imperium. This history wants to name clearly why this particular turn matters so much to its larger argument. The Sisterhood had spent centuries carefully seeding belief across 1,000 worlds precisely because they understood, in their own careful internal theory, that seeded belief could prove genuinely powerful once a population had lived with it long enough to internalize it as authentic tradition. What their theory apparently underestimated was how completely that power could be claimed by someone entirely outside Sisterhood control, someone motivated by his own personal and political ambition rather than by any loyalty to the institution that had originally planted the seed generations before his own birth. Paul possessed several considerable advantages in claiming this prophecy that the Sisterhood's original design had never specifically anticipated combining in a single figure his mother's own thorough, if partially unauthorized, Bene Gesserit training, his own demonstrated physical and mental capability, and the sheer desperate urgency of his and Jessica's circumstances following House Atreides' destruction, all of it converging to make him an unusually credible, unusually capable claimant to a role the Sisterhood had originally designed for considerably more modest, considerably more narrowly defensive purposes. The Fremen themselves, for their part, received Paul's arrival through the framework their own generations of accumulated tradition had already prepared them to expect, testing him against the specific signs their prophecy described and finding, again and again, that he genuinely matched them, not because the Sisterhood had somehow orchestrated this particular match from a distance, but because Paul's own genuinely extraordinary capability, combined with his mother's own genuinely thorough training, happened to align remarkably well with signs the Missionaria Protectiva had planted generations earlier for entirely different, considerably more limited reasons. What began in the Sisterhood's own original design as a carefully controlled safety mechanism had become, by the time Paul finished demonstrating his own capability to Fremen satisfaction, an entirely uncontrolled instrument of personal and political ascension, wielded by someone the Sisterhood could no longer meaningfully influence, let alone actually direct, precisely because he now possessed, through Fremen recognition, an authority considerably beyond anything the Sisterhood's own institutional standing could actually override. It is worth naming, too, the particular irony embedded in how thoroughly Fremen culture itself had transformed the Missionaria Protectiva's original seeding across the generations since its initial planting. What Bene Gesserit agents had planted as a relatively simple, functional prophecy had grown, through generations of genuine Fremen religious development, into something considerably richer and considerably more deeply woven into Fremen identity than its original architects had ever specifically designed. Fremen scholars and religious leaders had spent generations elaborating on the original seeded signs, adding layers of interpretation and expectation the Sisterhood's own original planning had never anticipated needing to account for. This meant that by the time Paul actually arrived among the Fremen, the prophecy waiting to receive him was not the comparatively modest, narrowly functional tool the Sisterhood had originally planted, but something considerably more powerful, considerably more emotionally resonant, and considerably more ready to be claimed by a genuinely capable figure than anyone within the Missionaria. Protectiva's original careful design had ever specifically intended it to become. The specific signs Fremen tradition had come to associate with their long-awaited prophecy included details considerably more elaborate than the Missionaria Protectiva's original seeding had specifically planted. Additions and refinements Fremen religious tradition itself had developed across the generations since the original seeding first took root. This organic elaboration, occurring entirely through Fremen cultural development rather than through any continued sisterhood involvement, meant the prophecy Paul actually encountered had grown into something considerably richer and considerably more specific than anything the original Missionaria Protectiva agents could have precisely anticipated when they first planted the underlying belief. Generations earlier, this organic growth of seeded belief, occurring entirely outside any institution's ongoing direction, represents one of the clearest possible illustrations of exactly the uncertainty this history traced in its second chapter. A seed planted with one specific intention growing across generations of genuine, independent cultural development into something its original planters could never have fully predicted or fully controlled. Liet Kynes, the imperial planetologist who had himself gone native among the Fremen years before Paul's arrival, occupied a particularly interesting position within this unfolding story. Possessing genuine scientific understanding of Arrakis's ecology, alongside deep personal investment in Fremen prophecy and Fremen tradition. His own father had in fact contributed significantly to the specific shape Fremen messianic expectation had taken by the time Paul actually arrived. Another instance of individual human contribution shaping the prophecy's eventual content in ways the original Missionaria Protectiva seeding had never specifically anticipated or directed. Kynes' own eventual assistance to Paul and Jessica during their most desperate early days in the desert, offered from his own personal conviction rather than through any institutional design, proved genuinely consequential to their survival. Yet another instance of individual human choice mattering enormously to outcomes no careful institutional planning, sisterhood or otherwise, had actually arranged in advance. Chani's own mother, Ferula, and the wider community of Fremen women who eventually welcomed Jessica and Paul into genuine CH life contributed their own considerable influence to how thoroughly the two newcomers actually integrated into Fremen daily existence. A process of practical acceptance that mattered every bit as much to Paul's eventual standing as the more dramatic prophetic recognition this history has focused on so far. This organic, community-driven acceptance mattered enormously to Paul's eventual standing, since Fremen culture placed genuine value on demonstrated trustworthiness earned through daily shared life. A standard that no amount of prophetic recognition alone, however dramatic, could have fully satisfied on its own without this considerably slower, considerably more intimate process of everyday mutual acceptance. Up next in Chapter 11, Muad'Dib, when their own prophecy escaped their hands, we'll uncover exactly how thoroughly Paul's rise as Muad'Dib moved beyond anything the sisterhood could still meaningfully influence. Paul's transformation into Muad'Dib, the Fremen name that would eventually become synonymous with the most consequential religious and military movement the Imperium had witnessed in generations, unfolded with a speed and a completeness that left the sisterhood watching from whatever distant, fragmentary intelligence they could still gather, increasingly unable to do anything beyond simply observe what their own centuries-old seeding had ultimately produced. This chapter traces exactly how thoroughly that transformation escaped any remaining sisterhood influence, and why the specific mechanism of that escape matters so much to understanding the true, complicated nature of institutional control. Paul's rise among the Fremen depended on considerably more than simply matching the specific prophetic signs Missionaria Protectiva seeding had planted generations earlier. It depended equally on his own demonstrated combat capability, proven decisively when he killed Jameis in ritual combat and earned genuine Fremen respect through, means entirely outside any Bene Gesserit design. It depended on his growing prescient ability, an emerging capability the Sisterhood's own genetic theory had specifically anticipated as part of the Kwisatz Haderach's eventual nature, but whose actual practical development, occurring under desert survival pressure rather than careful institutional supervision, unfolded in ways no Sisterhood observer could closely monitor or meaningfully shape. And it depended, perhaps most significantly of all, on Paul's own deliberate, considered choices about how to use the authority Fremen recognition increasingly granted him. Choices made entirely according to his own judgment and his own developing political ambition, informed by his mother's training and his own considerable natural capability, but answerable to no Sisterhood oversight whatsoever once he had moved beyond their reach into the deep desert. This history wants to draw particular attention to the specific quality of Paul's authority as it developed among the Fremen, because it illustrates something important about why the Sisterhood's careful, patient method of influence, so effective across centuries of subtle genetic and religious cultivation, proved almost entirely powerless once actually confronted with a single, sufficiently capable, sufficiently charismatic individual operating with genuine autonomy. The Sisterhood's traditional methods worked through patient accumulation across generations, gradual genetic convergence, gradually developing religious tradition, subtle influence exercised carefully across many individuals' small decisions over very long spans of time. Paul's rise happened on a compressed timeline measured in months and years rather than generations, driven by his own individual decisions and his own individual capability rather than by any patient institutional process the Sisterhood could recognize or meaningfully engage with using their traditional tools. Fremen tradition itself, examined honestly, contributed considerably to this rapid, uncontrollable acceleration. A population already primed by generations of seeded prophecy to expect and recognize a coming Messiah proved remarkably receptive to Paul's own demonstrated qualities, creating a feedback loop where each new demonstration of his capability reinforced existing Fremen belief, which in turn granted him greater authority and greater opportunity to demonstrate further capability. An accelerating cycle that gathered its own considerable momentum entirely independent of anything the Sisterhood could still meaningfully direct from their own increasingly distant, increasingly powerless institutional position. By the time Paul had fully assumed the mantle of Muad'Dib, commanding genuine Fremen loyalty and beginning to accumulate the kind of military and religious authority that would eventually allow him to challenge the Emperor himself, the Sisterhood's own relationship to their own centuries-old genetic and religious project had inverted entirely. They had spent generations carefully cultivating the conditions that made a figure like Paul possible. They now found themselves reduced to anxious observers, watching a project they had originally designed unfold according to a logic and a momentum entirely outside their own remaining institutional control. Capable of forming careful assessments and careful warnings, but no longer capable of actually altering the trajectory their own patient work had ultimately set into motion. It is worth considering, too, how differently this entire chapter of history might read had Paul possessed less genuine capability underneath the prophecy he ultimately claimed. Fremen culture, for all its genuine receptiveness to seeded belief, was not a population easily fooled by empty performance, and Paul's rise depended, at every single stage, on his own demonstrated combat skill, his own demonstrated wisdom, his own demonstrated willingness to share genuinely in Fremen hardship rather than simply claiming authority from some position of comfortable safety. The prophecy opened a door. It did not walk Paul through it. That walking required capability entirely his own, developed through his mother's teaching and his own considerable natural gift, and the harsh, immediate pressure of genuine desert survival. None of it something the sisterhood's distant, fragmentary observation could meaningfully claim credit for shaping in any detailed, ongoing way. This distinction between opening an opportunity and actually walking through it sits at the very heart of why the sisterhood's careful centuries of preparation proved, in the end, considerably less determinative than either the sisterhood themselves or many later observers ever fully appreciated. Chani's own role in Paul's rise deserves particular mention here as well, since his relationship with her, developing through genuine shared hardship and genuine mutual respect rather than through any institutional arrangement, grounded Paul's own experience of Fremen life in ways that considerably deepened his credibility among the wider Fremen population. This relationship, entirely personal and entirely outside any sisterhood design, nonetheless contributed significantly to the practical political and religious authority Paul eventually accumulated. Another instance of genuinely human connection shaping consequential historical outcomes in ways no careful institutional planning could have specifically arranged or specifically anticipated. The cumulative effect of all these independent, uncoordinated factors, Paul's own capability, Chani's genuine partnership, Fremen culture's own organic development of the seeded prophecy, converged to produce an outcome considerably larger and considerably more consequential than any single contributing factor, examined in isolation, could have plausibly produced on its own. Stilgar, the Fremen Naib, who eventually became one of Paul's most loyal and most consequential supporters, deserves particular attention here as well. Since his own gradual acceptance of Paul as a genuine leader, earned through demonstrated capability rather than granted through prophecy alone, illustrates how thoroughly Fremen political culture required actual, proven merit alongside prophetic recognition before genuinely committing its considerable military and political support. Stilgar's own journey from cautious skepticism to genuine devoted loyalty traces, in miniature, the wider Fremen population's own gradual embrace of Paul across his early years among them. This requirement for demonstrated merit, layered on top of prophetic recognition, meant Paul's rise depended on considerably more than simply matching seeded expectation, requiring him to continuously earn and re-earn Fremen confidence through repeated genuine demonstration of exactly the qualities their culture valued most highly. The considerable military training Paul received from Stilgar and other experienced Fremen fighters during these early months proved every bit as consequential to his eventual capability as anything his more formal childhood education had provided. Desert combat and desert survival skills that no Bene Gesserit or Mentat curriculum, however comprehensive, could have specifically anticipated needing to teach a future imperial ruler. Paul's own growing prescient awareness during this period, still developing and still unreliable in its earliest manifestations, added its own considerable complexity to his relationship with Fremen mentors like Stilgar, who found themselves training a student whose own unfolding abilities sometimes exceeded, in ways neither fully understood, what conventional Fremen combat wisdom alone could have anticipated or explained. Stilgar's own later reflections on this early period suggest he recognized something genuinely unusual in Paul considerably before most other Fremen did. An instinct he chose to test patiently through repeated observation rather than simply accepting on faith. Exactly the kind of careful skepticism Fremen survival culture had always considered a genuine virtue. Up next in Chapter 12, the Jihad, the Sisterhood Never Authorized, will uncover the catastrophic religious war that followed Paul's rise, and the devastating scale of consequence the sisterhood's own careful planning had never once intended to unleash. Paul's eventual military triumph over Emperor Shaddam and House Harkonnen, achieved through a combination of Fremen military capability, his own prescient strategic insight, and the political leverage created by his control over Arrakis and its irreplaceable spice production, secured him the imperial throne itself. What followed this political victory, however, proved considerably more consequential and considerably more devastating than any single political succession. A religious jihad carried forward in Paul's name across countless worlds throughout the Imperium, ultimately claiming billions of lives in a wave of conquest and conversion the sisterhood had never once authorized, never once intended, and found themselves, once it had truly begun, almost entirely powerless to actually stop. This history wants to be precise about exactly what the sisterhood did and did not intend regarding this catastrophic outcome, because the distinction matters considerably to understanding the true nature of their lost control. The sisterhood had, across centuries of patient work, deliberately cultivated the conditions that made a figure like Paul possible: the genetic convergence, the seeded prophecy, the careful genetic and religious infrastructure that eventually allowed an extraordinarily capable young man to claim both political and religious authority simultaneously. In this narrow sense, the jihad's underlying conditions trace directly back to sisterhood design, but the jihad's actual scale, its specific character as a devastating religious war carried forward by fanatically devoted Fremen legions across countless worlds who had never previously known Fremen combat capability or Fremen religious conviction, represented something the sisterhood's own careful planning had never specifically intended or anticipated. Their genetic theory had focused on producing a Kwisatz Haderach capable of accessing ancestral memory and perceiving probability with unprecedented clarity. It had not specifically planned for that same figure, choosing to weaponize the religious devotion Missionaria Protectiva seeding had cultivated across generations, transforming careful protective prophecy into the ideological engine of the single most devastating military campaign the Imperium had witnessed in recorded memory. Paul himself, in the considerable internal reflection later accounts attribute to him, appears to have recognized the jihad's terrible momentum with genuine, anguished clarity, understanding through his own developing prescience that his rise had set into motion forces that had already grown considerably beyond what even he, standing at the very center of the movement bearing his name, could actually control or meaningfully redirect. If the figure the entire prophecy centered around found himself unable to fully control the religious and military momentum his own rise had unleashed, the sisterhood, watching from their own considerably more distant and considerably more limited vantage point, possessed even less genuine capacity to intervene. This history argues, the single clearest and single most devastating illustration of everything the preceding chapters have been building toward. The sisterhood's centuries-long project had succeeded in producing exactly the kind of extraordinary figure their careful genetic theory predicted was possible. That very success then generated consequence entirely beyond anyone's meaningful control. Not because any single decision within the sisterhood's careful planning had been wrong in isolation, but because the accumulated momentum of genuine religious conviction, genuine military capability, and genuine political circumstance, once set fully into motion, proved considerably more powerful than any single institution's remaining capacity to redirect or restrain it. The sisterhood's own internal response to the unfolding jihad combined genuine horror at the scale of consequence with a kind of grim, professional recognition of exactly what had actually happened. that their careful centuries-long cultivation of controlled outcomes had ultimately produced an outcome no longer controlled by anyone at all, including, in his own most honest private moments, Paul himself. Billions of lives were lost across this devastating campaign, a human cost this history does not intend to minimize or rush past. A genuine tragedy that stands as perhaps the starkest possible evidence of exactly how far careful institutional planning can drift from actual, lived consequence, once set into motion across a galaxy this vast and this genuinely unpredictable. It is worth sitting, too, with the specific mechanism through which religious conviction, once genuinely internalized by an entire population, becomes so remarkably difficult for any outside institution to redirect or restrain. The Fremen legions who carried Paul's jihad across countless worlds did not act as instruments of any careful sisterhood design, nor even, in any simple sense, as instruments of Paul's own individual will. They acted from their own genuine, deeply held religious conviction, a conviction the Missionaria Protectiva had helped cultivate generations earlier, but which had long since become something the Fremen themselves owned completely, independent of whatever institution had originally planted its earliest seed. This is precisely why the jihad proved so resistant to any attempt at restraint, from the sisterhood or, in his own most anguished private moments, from Paul himself. Genuine religious conviction, once it belongs fully to the people who hold it, answers to considerably deeper and considerably more durable forces than any single institution's careful original intention. However patient and however sophisticated that original intention actually was. The specific mechanics through which religious devotion translated into sustained military capability across so many separate Fremen legions deserve further attention here, since this translation depended on factors considerably beyond simple belief alone. Existing Fremen combat tradition, honed across generations of harsh desert survival, genuine logistical capability built around spice production and desert mobility, and a cultural tradition of fierce, disciplined warfare that predated Paul's own arrival by many generations. Paul's rise provided ideological purpose and centralized direction to capability that had, in some important sense, already existed within Fremen culture, independent of anything the Missionaria Protectiva had specifically cultivated. This combination, pre-existing capability married to newly unified religious purpose, produced a military and religious movement of considerably greater scale and considerably greater momentum than either factor alone could have generated. Another instance of independent forces converging in ways no single institution's careful planning could have fully anticipated or fully controlled. The specific religious language Paul himself employed throughout the jihad, drawing heavily on the Missionaria Protectiva's original seeded vocabulary, while expanding it considerably to justify the campaign's growing scope, deserves brief additional mention here, since it illustrates how thoroughly he had internalized and then transformed the sisterhood's own careful original design, using their own planted terminology to authorize consequences their original seeding had never once intended to sanction. It is worth remembering that Paul's own considerable anguish over the jihad's scale did not translate into any actual capacity to halt it. A painful gap between private conscience and public consequence that this history suspects offered him little genuine comfort, even as it offered later observers considerable insight into exactly how difficult restraining collective religious momentum actually proves once it has been fully, genuinely unleashed. Up next in Chapter 13, Aliyah and the abomination they could not prevent will uncover a second, more intimate tragedy unfolding within Paul's own family, one the sisterhood's own careful safeguards proved equally powerless to prevent. While the jihad unfolded across countless worlds throughout the Imperium, a second, considerably more intimate tragedy was already taking shape within Paul's own immediate family. One the sisterhood's own careful institutional safeguards had specifically designed to prevent, and which nonetheless occurred anyway, through circumstances that once again illustrate exactly how thoroughly individual human choice could override even the most carefully considered institutional protection. Jessica, pregnant with her daughter Alia during her own transformation into a Fremen Reverend Mother, underwent the dangerous water of life ordeal while carrying her unborn child, meaning the flood of ancestral memory and awareness that transformation granted reached Alia as well. Delivered not to a fully formed adult consciousness capable of managing the psychological weight of countless inherited lives, but to a mind not yet born, unprepared in every meaningful developmental sense for the extraordinary burden it was about to receive. The sisterhood's own careful theoretical framework had specifically anticipated exactly this kind of danger, developing over generations a considerable body of protocol and caution around exactly when and how Reverend Mother transformation should safely occur. Protocol built specifically to prevent ancestral memory from overwhelming and insufficiently prepared consciousness. Jessica's transformation occurred, however, under the specific pressures of her and Paul's Fremen exile, circumstances the sisterhood's original careful sequence had never anticipated needing to accommodate, and her own pregnancy at the time introduced exactly the danger their careful protocol existed to prevent. Alia was born already carrying the accumulated awareness of countless generations of Reverend Mother ancestral memory, a condition later Bene Gesserit terminology would formally name abomination, describing the genuine risk that a sufficiently powerful ancestral personality present within this inherited awareness might grow strong enough to seize dominant, permanent control over the child's own developing consciousness before that consciousness had matured sufficiently to maintain its own stable identity against such overwhelming internal pressure. This history wants to name clearly why Alia's particular tragedy belongs so centrally within this larger account of lost sisterhood control. Unlike the jihad, which flowed from a complex chain of political and religious circumstance, the sisterhood could at least claim partial distance from. Alia's condition traced directly back to the sisterhood's own core biological technology. The water of life transformation itself, applied under circumstances their own careful protocol specifically existed to prevent. This was not a case of sisterhood planning being hijacked or exceeded by outside forces. This was a case of the sisterhood's own careful safeguards proving simply insufficient against the specific, unusual circumstances Jessica's own earlier choices had already set into motion. Alia grew up possessing extraordinary capability considerably beyond her chronological age, speaking and reasoning with the accumulated wisdom of countless prior lives even as a young child, a capability that made her, in practical terms, one of the most formidable individuals in the entire Imperium almost from infancy. But this same capability carried, embedded permanently within it, the specific danger her unusual prenatal transformation had created. A vulnerability to exactly the kind of internal takeover for the sisterhood's careful protocol had always existed to prevent, and which would eventually, years later, prove tragically realized when the accumulated presence of her own grandfather, the former Baron Harkonnen, gradually seized dominant control over her own consciousness. The sisterhood watched Alia's development with the same combination of alarm and powerlessness that had characterized their response to nearly every consequential development since Jessica's original choice first set this entire chain of events into motion. They understood, better than almost anyone else in the Imperium, exactly what danger Alia's condition actually represented. They possessed, by this point, almost no remaining practical capacity to actually intervene. Watching from a position of considerable theoretical expertise and considerably diminished practical influence as a tragedy their own careful protocol had specifically anticipated unfolded anyway, entirely beyond their reach. It is worth considering, too, how this specific tragedy differed from every other consequence this history has traced so far. The jihad, whatever its devastating scale, at least unfolded through a chain of comprehensible human choices and comprehensible political circumstance. Alia's condition arrived through something considerably more directly biological, a specific, identifiable failure of protocol occurring at a specific, identifiable moment, Jessica's own transformation undertaken while carrying an unborn child under exactly the kind of pressured, improvised circumstances the sisterhood's careful original timeline had never intended to allow. This directness matters to how this history assesses sisterhood responsibility across its various chapters, where the jihad flowed from many converging forces only partially traceable to sisterhood design. Alia's abomination traces back considerably more cleanly to a single specific choice, made under specific pressured circumstances, that directly violated protocol the sisterhood's own careful theory had specifically developed to prevent exactly this outcome. It stands, in this important sense, as perhaps the most purely tragic consequence this entire history examines, a harm neither fully intended nor fully external, but produced instead by the same accumulating chain of individual choice this account has traced since Jessica's very first quiet decision at Caladan. The sisterhood's own subsequent study of Alia's particular case contributed considerably to their evolving understanding of exactly how preborn transformation actually worked, knowledge that would eventually inform considerably more careful protocol governing similar situations in the centuries that followed. This represents one of the few genuinely constructive outcomes to emerge from an otherwise largely tragic episode. An institution learning, through painful direct experience, lessons their prior theoretical understanding had never quite fully anticipated needing to learn. Alia herself, throughout the years before her eventual tragic transformation into full abomination, contributed genuinely valuable political and strategic capability to Paul's own reign, her inherited ancestral wisdom proving useful across countless difficult decisions, even as the underlying vulnerability her unusual transformation had created continued quietly accumulating pressure beneath her. Considerable, precocious capability. The broader Bene Gesserit medical and genetic understanding gained from studying Alia's particular case would eventually prove valuable in preventing at least some similar tragedies among later generations of trained sisters. A small measure of genuine institutional learning emerging from an otherwise largely painful chapter in the sisterhood's long history. Though this later benefit offered little practical comfort to Alia herself, or to the family that watched her own gradual, tragic transformation unfold. It is worth remembering, too, that Jessica herself carried considerable private guilt regarding Alia's condition for the remainder of her own life, understanding clearly that her own earlier choice to conceive Paul against explicit instruction had set into motion the exact chain of pressured circumstance that later led to her own dangerous transformation while pregnant with her daughter. This particular grief, quiet and largely private, deserves its own gentle acknowledgement within this history, a reminder that even the most consequential institutional narrative is ultimately built from countless smaller, more personal sorrows that rarely receive the same careful attention as the grander events surrounding them. Up next, in Chapter 14, Watching from the Outside, the Sisterhood under Paul's Empire, we'll uncover exactly how diminished the sisterhood's practical influence had actually become once Paul's empire reached its full extent. By the time Paul's empire reached its full territorial and religious extent, The sisterhood found themselves occupying a position considerably different from the one their centuries of patient planning had ever anticipated holding. No longer the careful architects quietly guiding events from behind the scenes, but distant, largely powerless observers watching an emperor who owed his existence to their own genetic project, while remaining almost entirely beyond their institutional reach or influence. This chapter traces the specific texture of this diminished relationship because it illustrates something important about the nature of institutional power that the preceding chapters have only implied. That influence built through patient, gradual cultivation across generations does not automatically translate into influence over the specific, powerful individuals that cultivation eventually produces. The sisterhood had spent centuries carefully positioning themselves as essential advisors to noble houses throughout the Imperium, genetic consultants, truth-saying diplomats, trusted keepers of accumulated wisdom no other institution could match. Paul, once he assumed the imperial throne, needed remarkably little of what the sisterhood had traditionally offered other rulers, possessing his own prescient insight considerably exceeding anything a sisterhood advisor could provide, his own considerable political and military capability, and his own complicated, often actively hostile relationship with the very institution that had, in the most literal biological sense, made his existence possible. Individual sisters maintained whatever access they could manage within Paul's court, gathering intelligence and occasionally offering counsel where genuinely welcomed. But the wider sisterhood leadership understood clearly that their traditional methods of patient influence carried considerably less weight against an emperor who could, through his own prescient ability, often anticipate their careful maneuvering before it had even fully taken shape. This represents its own particular irony, worth naming directly. An institution built around careful observation and subtle influence finding itself observed and anticipated in turn by the very figure their own genetic project had ultimately produced. The sisterhood's own internal deliberation during this period, insofar as surviving records allow reconstruction, reveals genuine disagreement about how best to respond to their diminished circumstances. Some senior Reverend Mothers apparently argued for more direct confrontation, attempting to reassert sisterhood authority through whatever remaining institutional leverage they retained. Others counseled patient accommodation, waiting out Paul's reign while preserving what institutional continuity they could manage, trusting that the sisterhood's own considerably longer institutional timeline would eventually outlast any single emperor's rule. However extraordinary that particular emperor's own individual capability might currently appear. This second, more patient approach ultimately prevailed within sisterhood strategy, reflecting perhaps the order's deepest institutional instinct, that genuine power lay in outlasting rather than directly confronting forces temporarily beyond their control. Whatever the wisdom of this particular strategic choice, it required the sisterhood to accept, at least for the duration of Paul's own reign. A position of genuine institutional weakness considerably different from the careful, confident influence their centuries of patient cultivation had once seemed to promise. The jihad's continuing devastation across this same period only deepened the sisterhood's own complicated relationship with the empire their genetic project had ultimately produced. Watching billions of lives lost across a campaign carried forward in the name of a prophecy their own missionaria protectiva had originally planted, while possessing almost no practical capacity to meaningfully slow or redirect its continuing momentum. This combination, genuine institutional responsibility for the underlying conditions and genuine institutional powerlessness over the actual unfolding consequence, created a particular kind of quiet anguish this history suspects many individual sisters carried personally throughout this entire difficult period, understanding intimately how their own order's careful work had contributed to devastation on a scale none of their original careful planning had ever actually intended to produce. It is worth considering, too, what this diminished position actually cost individual sisters serving within or near Paul's court during these years. Women who had trained their entire lives believing their accumulated skill and accumulated wisdom would carry genuine institutional weight wherever they were eventually assigned to serve, only to discover that weight considerably reduced against an emperor whose own prescient capability often rendered their most careful maneuvering transparent before it had even fully begun. This was a genuinely difficult adjustment for an order whose entire self-conception had always rested on the quiet confidence that patient skill, applied carefully enough, could eventually influence nearly any circumstance the sisterhood turned its attention toward. Paul's own personal relationship with individual sisters he had known since childhood, including his own mother, remained considerably warmer than his relationship with the wider institution itself, offering occasional genuine influence through personal channels even where formal institutional access remained limited. This distinction between personal relationship and institutional authority would recur throughout the remainder of this history, a reminder that even in their most diminished institutional moments, individual sisters often retained influence considerably beyond whatever the wider sisterhood's formal standing could actually claim. Individual sisters who maintained genuine access to Paul's inner circle during this period often found themselves navigating a particularly delicate position, valued for their personal relationship with the emperor, while simultaneously representing an institution whose wider interests did not always align neatly with his own increasingly independent priorities. This delicate balancing act required considerable personal skill, distinct from the more straightforward institutional influence sisters serving other noble houses across the Imperium typically enjoyed. The wider sisterhood leadership, for their part, learned to value these individual personal relationships precisely because they offered a form of access no amount of formal institutional standing could otherwise secure. A pragmatic adaptation that would prove increasingly important as the sisterhood's traditional methods of formal institutional influence continued eroding across the remainder of Paul's extraordinary reign. The specific economic dimension of sisterhood influence during Paul's reign deserves mention here as well, since the order's traditional methods of accumulating resources through genetic consultation and truth-saying services grew considerably more difficult to sustain under an emperor whose own household required considerably less of these traditional sisterhood services than prior noble houses typically had. This economic constraint compounded the sisterhood's already diminished political influence, forcing individual sisters to seek alternative sources of institutional support and institutional relevance across an empire increasingly organized around Paul's own singular, extraordinary capability. Some sisters found continued purpose serving noble houses beyond Paul's immediate court, maintaining traditional sisterhood influence across the wider Imperium, even as their access to the actual center of imperial power continued narrowing considerably compared to what earlier sisterhood generations had generally enjoyed. The sisterhood's own gradual adaptation to reduced influence during this period also produced valuable institutional learning about operating from a position of genuine weakness rather than genuine strength, lessons that would prove considerably more relevant during the even more severe crisis the order would eventually face generations later, when the honored maîtres returned from beyond the scattering to threaten their continued existence far more directly. This gradual erosion of formal standing proved, in its own quiet way, every bit as significant as any of the more dramatic crises examined elsewhere in this history. A slow reminder that institutional relevance, once lost through simple irrelevance rather than outright defeat, often proves considerably harder to reclaim than influence lost through any single dramatic confrontation. Up next, in Chapter 15, Leto II's independent vision will uncover how Paul's own son grew into a figure whose eventual choices would prove, if anything, even further beyond sisterhood influence than his father's had ever been. Leto II, Paul's son, grew up within a family already marked by Alia's dangerous prenatal transformation and his father's own increasingly complicated relationship with the sisterhood that had ultimately produced him. Where the sisterhood's own genetic and religious project had, through several generations of accumulated consequence, produced a Kwisatz Haderach whose rise had at least emerged from recognizable sisterhood seeding and sisterhood genetic design, Leto's own eventual path would prove considerably more independent still. A vision developed almost entirely through his own private reasoning and his own access to inherited ancestral memory, owing remarkably little to any continuing sisterhood guidance or sisterhood expectation. Leto possessed, from a very young age, the same kind of prescient capability that had characterized his father's own extraordinary development, but he applied this capability toward a considerably longer and considerably more radical vision than anything Paul himself had ever fully embraced, what would eventually become known as the Golden Path, an extraordinarily long-term plan spanning thousands of years, designed to permanently alter humanity's relationship with prescient foresight itself, protecting the species from the very kind of catastrophic, single-point vulnerability that Paul's own rise as a singular prescient figure had, in Leto's own careful analysis, actually represented. This vision, developed almost entirely through Leto's own private reasoning rather than through any collaborative process involving sisterhood guidance, required him to undergo his own transformation, merging his own body with Sandtrout in a process that would eventually produce the extraordinary, terrifying physical form history would come to know as the God Emperor, granting him a lifespan measured in millennia and a physical capability that placed him entirely beyond any conventional military or political challenge the sisterhood, or indeed anyone else remaining in the Imperium, could realistically mount against him. The sisterhood's own reaction to Leto's emerging plan combined genuine alarm at its radical scope with a familiar, increasingly practiced sense of powerlessness regarding their own capacity to actually influence its unfolding. Leto, unlike his father, appeared to feel remarkably little obligation to accommodate sisterhood interest or sisterhood concern, pursuing his own extraordinarily long-term vision with a single-minded determination that treated the sisterhood as simply one more institution among many that would need to adapt to his own reign, rather than as any kind of genuine partner in shaping his own extraordinary path forward. This history argues, perhaps the most complete illustration across this entire account of exactly how far the sisterhood's original centuries-long project had drifted from anything resembling actual institutional control. They had set out, generations earlier, to produce a Kwisatz Haderach whose emergence they could carefully guide and carefully integrate into their own broader genetic and political ambitions. They had instead produced, across 2 consecutive generations, first a prophet whose rise triggered catastrophic religious war entirely beyond their control, and then a God Emperor whose multi-millennial vision would reshape human civilization according to a logic developed almost entirely independent of any sisterhood input whatsoever. Leto's own relationship with sisterhood tradition, examined closely, reveals a figure who drew freely on Bene Gesserit training, and Bene Gesserit accumulated knowledge where it served his own considerably larger purpose, while feeling no particular obligation to actually serve sisterhood institutional interest in return, treating their centuries of careful cultivation as simply one more resource available to him, rather than as any kind of binding relationship requiring his own reciprocal loyalty or accommodation. The sisterhood, watching this dynamic unfold across the early years of his extraordinary reign, faced perhaps their clearest evidence yet that whatever control they had once imagined themselves holding over their own genetic project had, by this point, essentially ceased to exist in any meaningful practical sense. It is worth pausing, too, on exactly how thoroughly Leto's chosen path diverged from anything resembling traditional sisterhood values, even as it drew freely on sisterhood knowledge and sisterhood technique. The Bene Gesserit tradition, whatever its own considerable ambition, had always operated through influence exercised upon others, careful cultivation of bloodlines and beliefs belonging, ultimately, to other people across other households and other worlds. Leto's vision inverted this entirely, requiring him to transform his own body and sacrifice his own individual humanity across millennia specifically to protect humanity's future from exactly the kind of concentrated, singular control the sisterhood's own centuries of careful work had originally been designed to help produce. There is a considerable irony worth naming directly in this inversion, that the sisterhood's own patient genetic project ultimately produced a figure whose entire life's purpose became preventing anyone, including implicitly the sisterhood themselves, from ever again wielding the kind of singular prescient authority Leto's own father had briefly held. Their careful centuries of cultivation had produced, in this specific and genuinely startling sense, their own project's most thorough philosophical rejection. Leto's own extensive study of ancestral memory, drawing on the same other memory tradition the sisterhood had spent centuries carefully cultivating, deserves particular attention here, since his eventual vision emerged directly from insight this same sisterhood tradition had made possible, even as that vision's ultimate purpose ran directly counter to what the sisterhood themselves had originally intended their genetic project to accomplish. Leto drew on centuries of accumulated sisterhood wisdom to develop a plan the sisterhood themselves would likely never have chosen or approved, had they somehow retained the practical capacity to meaningfully object. This particular pattern, sisterhood knowledge and sisterhood capability being used toward purposes the sisterhood themselves never intended, would recur throughout the remainder of this history in one form after another. Perhaps the single most consistent thread running through this entire complicated account of institutional influence gradually outgrowing institutional control. Leto's own private reasoning, insofar as later accounts and his own recorded reflections allow reconstruction, suggests he genuinely believed his extraordinarily costly path represented the only viable way to protect humanity's long-term survival. A conviction held with a certainty that left remarkably little room for sisterhood counsel or sisterhood objection, however sophisticated that counsel might otherwise have been within a less singularly determined ruler's own decision-making process. The sisterhood's own eventual, grudging respect for Leto's vision, once its full scope became clearer across the early decades of his extraordinary reign, coexisted uneasily alongside their genuine institutional loss at watching their own centuries of careful genetic cultivation redirected so completely toward purposes they themselves had never chosen and could no longer meaningfully influence. Up next in Chapter 16, 3,500 Years of Waiting, we'll uncover how the sisterhood endured Leto's extraordinarily long reign, watching from a position of genuine, sustained powerlessness they had never previously experienced across their entire prior institutional history. Leto II's reign stretched across roughly 3,500 years, an almost unimaginable span even for an institution as accustomed to thinking in long generational timescales as the Bene Gesserit sisterhood had always been. This chapter traces what it actually meant for the sisterhood to endure this extraordinary duration, not as active participants in shaping events according to their own careful design, but as a comparatively powerless institution simply persisting alongside a god emperor whose own extraordinary lifespan and extraordinary capability placed him permanently beyond anything resembling their traditional methods of patient, gradual influence. The sisterhood's own institutional character during these long centuries settled into something considerably more modest than the confident, patient architects of earlier generations might have recognized. An order focused increasingly on simple survival and continuity rather than on any active, ambitious project of genetic or political shaping. Leto permitted the sisterhood to continue existing, understanding their own accumulated genetic knowledge and their own accumulated institutional memory held some continuing value, even within his own extraordinarily long-term vision. But he did so entirely on his own terms, extracting what he found useful from sisterhood tradition while offering remarkably little genuine partnership or genuine deference in return. This particular relationship illustrates something worth naming carefully within this history's larger argument: the specific difference between an institution being actively opposed and an institution being simply rendered irrelevant to the actual decisions shaping the wider Imperium's fate. Direct opposition, however dangerous, at least implies a rough equality of consequence, two forces genuinely contesting the same outcome. What the sisterhood experienced under Leto's long reign was something considerably more humbling than opposition: a gradual, sustained irrelevance to decisions of enormous consequence being made by a single figure whose own extraordinary capability had simply outgrown any need for their traditional methods of careful, patient influence. Individual sisters serving during these centuries developed their own particular strategies for maintaining institutional purpose and institutional morale under these genuinely difficult circumstances, focusing energy on preserving accumulated knowledge, maintaining careful genetic records even where their practical application remained limited, and continuing the patient training of new sisters according to traditions whose ultimate purpose had grown considerably less certain than in earlier, more confident sisterhood generations. This persistence itself deserves genuine recognition within this history. An institution choosing to maintain its own careful discipline and its own careful standards even during centuries when the practical payoff of that discipline remained genuinely unclear. Leto's own eventual death, engineered deliberately as part of his own extraordinarily long-term Golden Path vision, finally brought this particular chapter of sustained sisterhood powerlessness to its close. Though what followed would prove, in its own way, every bit as challenging to whatever remaining sense of institutional control the sisterhood still hoped to reclaim. Leto's death triggered the beginning of what history would come to call the Scattering, an unprecedented wave of human dispersal across the galaxy and beyond, driven by populations determined never again to allow any single figure or any single institution the kind of totalizing prescient control Leto's own extraordinary reign had represented. The sisterhood, emerging from 3,500 years of patient endurance, found themselves facing an entirely new kind of challenge to their traditional methods. Not a single overwhelming figure whose capability exceeded their own institutional reach, but an entire scattered, dispersed humanity actively determined to escape exactly the kind of centralized, prescient oversight the sisterhood's own traditional methods of patient influence had always ultimately depended upon being able to reach. It is worth remembering, too, that endurance of this kind carries its own genuine institutional cost, even when it ultimately proves successful. Sisters who lived and died across these 3,500 years never personally witnessed whatever eventual resolution their patient continuation might someday produce, contributing instead to an institutional project whose true shape and true outcome remained entirely uncertain throughout their own individual lifetimes. This particular kind of patient sacrifice considerably more passive than the dramatic genetic and religious ambition of earlier sisterhood generations, nonetheless required its own genuine discipline, a willingness to simply continue, faithfully and without complaint, work whose ultimate purpose had grown considerably less certain than in the sisterhood's earlier, more confident centuries. This quiet endurance deserves genuine recognition within this history's larger account, not as evidence of the sisterhood somehow reclaiming meaningful control over their own circumstances, but as evidence of something this account has increasingly come to recognize as their most durable underlying quality, an institutional capacity to persist with genuine discipline even through centuries, offering no clear guarantee that persistence would eventually prove worthwhile. The specific texture of daily sisterhood life during Leto's long reign deserves brief further mention here, since it illustrates how thoroughly institutional purpose can persist even when its ultimate practical outcome remains genuinely uncertain. Sisters continued training students, continued maintaining careful genetic records, continued the patient work of Bene Gesserit tradition, largely because that work had become, across so many prior generations, simply what the sisterhood was, and what individual sisters understood themselves to be, regardless of whether Leto's overwhelming presence left much practical room for that work to meaningfully influence the wider Imperium's actual trajectory. This capacity to maintain purposeful institutional identity, even during centuries of genuine practical powerlessness, represents its own quiet form of resilience, worth recognizing honestly within this history's larger account of an institution whose relationship with actual control proved, again and again, considerably more complicated than their confident public reputation ever suggested. The specific relationship between Leto and his own twin sister Ganima during the early years of his transformation deserves brief mention here, since her own choices, including her eventual decision not to pursue the same transformative path her brother chose, illustrate how thoroughly individual choice continued shaping consequential Atreides family history, even within a story increasingly dominated by Leto's own singular, extraordinary vision. Ganima's own life, considerably more conventional than her brother's extraordinary transformation, nonetheless carried its own genuine significance within the wider unfolding Atreides story. The sisterhood's own relationship with Ganima proved somewhat warmer than their relationship with Leto himself, offering another small instance of how individual personal relationships continued mattering even as the wider institutional relationship between sisterhood and Atreides dynasty grew increasingly distant and increasingly one-sided in practical terms. Sisters who maintained whatever limited contact with Leto's court still remained possible during these long centuries, developed their own considerable expertise in reading his rare, indirect communications, learning to extract genuine insight from an emperor who spoke, when he spoke at all, in terms shaped by a perspective spanning millennia rather than the considerably more immediate concerns any ordinary human institution typically operated within. This same period also saw individual sisters quietly developing new areas of expertise entirely outside their traditional genetic and religious focus, adapting their considerable analytical training toward whatever practical problems the wider Imperium's population actually needed solved. A pragmatic diversification that would prove genuinely useful once the sisterhood eventually needed to rebuild broader relevance following Leto's extraordinary reign. Up next, in Chapter 17, The Scattering, Humanity Beyond Their Reach, we'll uncover how humanity's unprecedented dispersal across the galaxy left the sisterhood facing challenges their careful institutional methods had never previously needed to address. The scattering represented something genuinely unprecedented in the entire span of human history. The Bene Gesserit sisterhood had spent so many centuries carefully tracking an enormous, largely uncoordinated wave of human dispersal, carrying countless populations far beyond the traditional boundaries of the known Imperium, driven by a shared, urgent determination never again to allow any single figure or any single institution the kind of totalizing prescient oversight Leto's extraordinary reign had represented across its 3,500 years. This chapter traces exactly why the scattering proved so uniquely challenging to the Sisterhood's traditional methods of patient, careful influence, methods that had always depended, at their most fundamental level, on the ability to actually locate and actually reach the populations they hoped to influence across sufficient time to allow careful cultivation to take root. The Sisterhood's entire breeding index, their entire Missionaria Protectiva seeding program, their entire centuries-long approach to genetic and religious influence assumed a relatively bounded, relatively trackable human population scattered across many worlds certainly, but connected enough through imperial administration and guild transportation that careful institutional attention could eventually reach nearly anywhere it needed to. The scattering shattered this fundamental assumption entirely. Populations fled not simply to distant worlds within reach of existing transportation networks, but to genuinely unknown regions of space, deliberately obscuring their own location and their own continuing development, specifically to escape any possibility of future prescient tracking or future institutional oversight. This meant, in the most practical terms available to the Sisterhood's own careful institutional planning, that an unknown but clearly substantial portion of humanity's future genetic and cultural development was now occurring entirely beyond their observation, let alone their influence. Populations evolving according to their own independent circumstances, with no continuing connection to Sisterhood breeding, records, or Sisterhood religious seeding whatsoever. The Sisterhood's own response to this unprecedented challenge revealed considerable institutional flexibility even amid genuine crisis, developing new methods of careful observation and careful outreach toward whatever scattered populations they could still locate and still reach, while acknowledging, in their own more honest internal deliberation, that a meaningful portion of humanity's future had now moved permanently beyond anything resembling their traditional, careful institutional reach. This acknowledgement itself represents a considerable shift from the confident, patient architects who had once believed their centuries-long genetic project could eventually encompass and eventually shape nearly the entirety of human civilization across the known Imperium. Some scattered populations, driven by generations of independent development entirely outside Sisterhood influence, would eventually return to known space, carrying capabilities and cultural developments the Sisterhood's own careful institutional theory had never specifically anticipated. Populations shaped by circumstances and pressures no Sisterhood genetic calculation had tracked or predicted. Among these returning populations, one in particular would eventually pose the single greatest existential threat the Sisterhood had faced across their entire recorded institutional history. A group of women who had developed their own considerable capability entirely independent of Bene Gesserit tradition, and who would return to known space with an aggression and a hostility toward the Sisterhood that no amount of careful genetic calculation had ever prepared them to face. This particular return, examined directly in the chapter immediately following this one, represents perhaps the ultimate consequence of the scattering's fundamental challenge to Sisterhood control. Proof that populations developing entirely outside institutional oversight could return not merely as unknown variables the Sisterhood simply needed to account for, but as genuinely dangerous rivals possessing their own considerable capability, shaped by influences and circumstances the Sisterhood's careful centuries of institutional planning had never once anticipated needing to actually defend against. It is worth considering, too, exactly what motivated so many populations to choose dispersal this total and this deliberate. Fleeing not merely from Leto's own extraordinary reign, but from the entire underlying possibility that any single figure or any single institution might again claim the kind of totalizing prescient oversight his 3.5 millennia had represented. This motivation reveals something important about how thoroughly Leto's own reign had reshaped humanity's collective relationship with institutions like the Sisterhood. A population now actively organizing its own future, specifically around evading exactly the kind of careful, patient, institutional attention the Sisterhood's entire traditional method had always depended upon being able to provide. The scattering represented, in this specific sense, humanity's own collective verdict on the entire multi-generational project this history has traced since its opening chapter. A determination shared across countless individual populations, making countless individual choices to flee. That the patient cultivation the Sisterhood had once offered as protection had become, through Leto's own extraordinary reign, something considerably closer to a danger worth fleeing at almost any cost. The practical mechanics of the scattering itself deserve brief further attention here, since the sheer logistical achievement of moving so many populations so far beyond known space represented its own remarkable feat of human ingenuity and human determination. Developing navigation and transportation methods considerably beyond what conventional guild technology had previously made available. This technical achievement, driven entirely by populations acting on their own initiative rather than through any centralized institutional direction, illustrates once again how thoroughly humanity's own collective capability could exceed what any single institution, including the Sisterhood, had ever specifically anticipated needing to account for. The scattering's populations, once genuinely dispersed beyond known space, began developing along countless independent trajectories, some maintaining loose connection with known space, others severing that connection almost entirely, creating exactly the kind of untracked genetic and cultural diversity the Sisterhood's careful centuries of institutional record-keeping had never previously needed to accommodate. Individual Sisterhood agents who volunteered to accompany scattered populations into the unknown, hoping to maintain at least some thread of institutional connection and institutional observation, faced genuine personal risk and genuine personal sacrifice, often losing all subsequent contact with the wider Sisterhood for the remainder of their own natural lives. Their willingness to accept this sacrifice, in service of preserving at least some fragment of ongoing Sisterhood awareness regarding humanity's dispersed future, deserves genuine recognition within this history's larger account of institutional persistence under genuinely difficult circumstances. Few of these embedded agents ever successfully returned to report their findings, meaning the Sisterhood's actual knowledge of what became of most scattered populations remained, across the many centuries that followed, considerably more fragmentary and considerably more uncertain than their careful institutional record-keeping generally preferred to acknowledge openly. The Sisterhood's own careful genetic records, so central to their traditional method of institutional influence, grew increasingly incomplete regarding these scattered populations with each passing generation, creating gaps in their accumulated knowledge that would eventually prove considerably consequential once elements of the scattering, including the honored matres themselves, finally began returning to known space in the centuries that followed. Some among the scattered populations maintained deliberate, careful records of their own independent development, hoping that some future generation might eventually choose to reconnect with known space and share what they had learned. a quiet act of long-term optimism that mirrored, in its own way, the same patient institutional instinct the sisterhood themselves had always represented, even from populations actively fleeing sisterhood influence. Up next, in Chapter 18, the honored mages, an enemy their calculations never predicted, will uncover the devastating threat that returned from beyond the scattering, and how close it actually came to destroying the sisterhood entirely. The honored matres emerged from the scattering as something the Bene Gesserit sisterhood had genuinely never faced before. Across their entire long institutional history, a population of women who shared certain superficial similarities with sisterhood tradition, considerable physical and psychological discipline, sophisticated sexual and political manipulation techniques, but who had developed these capabilities through generations of independent evolution, shaped by pressures and circumstances entirely outside anything Bene Gesserit training had ever needed to address. Producing an aggression and a ruthlessness the sisterhood's own more measured, more patient tradition had simply never cultivated to the same degree. This chapter traces exactly why the honored matres represented such a uniquely devastating challenge to sisterhood institutional confidence. Because, unlike every previous crisis this history has examined, from Jessica's original choice through Paul's jihad through Leto's independent vision, the honored matres arrived not as a consequence flowing from the sisterhood's own genetic and religious project, but as an entirely external force developed independently that returned specifically to conquer and destroy the very institution whose careful centuries of patient work had, in some genuine sense, helped create the conditions that eventually produced them. The honored matres pursued the sisterhood with a specific, sustained hostility that suggested their own institutional origins traced back, however distantly, to Bene Gesserit tradition itself. Populations that had fled during the scattering carrying fragments of sisterhood technique and sisterhood discipline, only to develop these fragments across generations of independent evolution into something considerably more aggressive and considerably less constrained by the ethical and philosophical framework that had always tempered traditional sisterhood practice. This particular origin, if the sisterhood's own later analysis proved accurate, meant they now faced an enemy that was, in some genuine sense, their own distant institutional relative, shaped by exactly the kind of uncontrolled, independent development this entire history has been tracing as the sisterhood's own recurring, defining vulnerability. The military and political campaign the honored matres waged against known space, and specifically against the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, proved devastating in ways the sisterhood's own centuries of careful institutional preparation had simply never anticipated needing to withstand. Entire sisterhood strongholds fell. Sisters were captured, killed, or in some documented cases, forcibly absorbed into honored matre ranks through techniques the sisterhood's own tradition found genuinely difficult to counter or even fully understand. The order that had spent centuries carefully cultivating influence across the entire Imperium now found itself fighting, in the most literal sense, for its own continued institutional survival. This crisis forced the sisterhood into a kind of honest institutional self-examination considerably more urgent than anything the preceding centuries had required, questioning long-held assumptions about their own methods, their own philosophy, and their own capacity to actually meet a threat this aggressive and this capable, using only their traditional tools of patient, gradual influence. Senior Reverend Mothers openly debated whether the sisterhood's own historical restraint, the careful ethical boundaries that had always distinguished their practice from more openly ruthless alternatives, had become a genuine liability against an enemy that recognized no comparable restraint whatsoever. The sisterhood's ultimate survival through this devastating conflict required exactly the kind of painful institutional adaptation this history's final chapters will trace directly: a willingness to fundamentally reconsider methods and assumptions that had remained largely stable across their entire prior institutional history. Forced not by any careful internal deliberation about how best to evolve, but by the blunt, urgent necessity of simply surviving an enemy their centuries of careful calculation had never once predicted they would eventually need to face. It is worth considering, too, what this particular crisis revealed about the actual, lived difference between sisterhood tradition and honored matra practice. A difference the sisterhood's own senior leadership found themselves examining with unusual honesty, precisely because their own institutional survival now depended on understanding it clearly. Honored matra technique often resembled Bene Gesserit method on its surface. Similar physical discipline, similar psychological insight, similar capacity for careful, deliberate influence over other people's behavior. What differed considerably and consequentially was the underlying philosophy constraining how that capability actually got used. Sisterhood tradition tempered by centuries of accumulated ethical consideration, the honored meters had simply never developed across their own considerably more compressed, considerably more survival-focused period of independent evolution. This comparison forced the sisterhood into genuinely uncomfortable territory, recognizing that their own historical restraint, a quality they had always considered central to their own institutional identity, might itself have become a liability against an enemy whose own considerably more ruthless practice recognized no comparable limitation whatsoever. The specific sisterhood strongholds the honored matras targeted during their devastating campaign tended to be selected with genuine strategic sophistication, striking at locations holding particular institutional or genetic significance rather than simply attacking wherever opportunity happened to present itself. This pattern suggests the honored matras possessed genuine, detailed knowledge of sisterhood institutional structure, knowledge that likely traced back to their own distant historical connection with Bene Gesserit tradition, allowing them to strike with a precision the sisterhood found particularly difficult to defend against, using their traditional methods of careful, patient institutional protection. This precision targeting forced the sisterhood into increasingly difficult strategic choices, weighing which institutional assets and which accumulated knowledge to prioritize protecting as their available resources and available strongholds continued diminishing across the campaign's devastating early years. Individual Reverend Mothers who survived the honored matras' early devastating assaults often carried, for the remainder of their lives, a particular kind of institutional trauma this history wants to name honestly. Watching centuries of accumulated sisterhood infrastructure and accumulated sisterhood knowledge destroyed within a comparatively short span of intense, devastating conflict. This trauma shaped sisterhood strategy and sisterhood culture considerably throughout the remainder of the crisis, producing an institution considerably more willing to consider radical adaptation than their more settled, more confident earlier centuries had ever seriously required of them. The psychological toll of this sustained existential threat deserves genuine acknowledgement within this history. An institution that had spent millennia cultivating careful, patient confidence suddenly forced to operate from a place of genuine, sustained fear for its own continued survival. The sisterhood's eventual decision to actively seek alliance and eventual merger with their own attackers, rather than continuing indefinite resistance, required a particular kind of institutional humility that many senior Reverend Mothers found genuinely difficult to accept, even once the practical necessity of this approach had become impossible to reasonably deny, given how thoroughly their traditional methods had failed to stem the honored matras' continuing advance. The specific psychological profile the honored matras cultivated among their own membership, built around absolute loyalty, secured through techniques the sisterhood found genuinely disturbing to study closely. meant captured territory rarely returned to anything resembling its prior state. A scorched earth approach to expansion that left the sisterhood facing not merely military defeat, but the wholesale erasure of communities and traditions they had spent centuries carefully cultivating. Several senior sisters who lived through this period later described it as the single greatest test of institutional faith the order had ever faced, considerably more demanding, in its own way, than any prior crisis this long history had traced across all the centuries preceding it. Up next, in Chapter 19, Forced to Change, the merger with the honored maters, will uncover how the sisterhood ultimately survived this existential crisis, and what fundamental change that survival actually required of them. The sisterhood's ultimate survival against the honored maters came not through military victory in any conventional sense, but through an unprecedented merger. Bene Gesserit tradition, combining formally with honored matri capability under the leadership of Murbella, a former honored matri herself, who had undergone Bene Gesserit training and emerged as a figure capable of bridging both traditions, creating an entirely new institutional entity that preserved elements of sisterhood philosophy and sisterhood discipline while incorporating honored matri capability the sisterhood's own traditional methods had proven unable to match on their own. This chapter wants to name honestly exactly what this merger actually represented within the larger argument this history has been building since its opening chapter. It was not, in any meaningful sense, a triumph of sisterhood control reasserting itself over circumstances that had grown beyond their reach. It was, considerably more precisely, an acknowledgement that pure sisterhood tradition alone, however sophisticated and however patiently cultivated across so many centuries, had proven genuinely insufficient to survive the specific existential threat the honored matris represented, requiring fundamental institutional transformation rather than any simple return to previously established methods. Murbella's own particular position, straddling both traditions, made her uniquely suited to lead this transformation, but her leadership also required the wider sisterhood to accept changes considerably more fundamental than anything their prior institutional history had ever demanded of them. Honored matri techniques, considerably more aggressive and considerably less philosophically constrained than traditional sisterhood practice, became integrated into what had previously been a considerably more measured, considerably more patient institutional approach. The order that emerged from this merger was, in genuine and important ways, no longer simply the Bene Gesserit sisterhood this history has traced across its preceding 18 chapters, but something new, forged specifically through the trauma and the necessity of nearly complete institutional destruction. This transformation illustrates, perhaps more clearly than any single episode this history has previously examined, the fundamental thesis running through this entire account that an institution built around careful, patient control of external circumstance ultimately survived not by successfully reasserting that control, but by accepting how thoroughly circumstances beyond their control had already reshaped what survival actually required of them. The sisterhood that emerged from this merger had not won back the total institutional control their earlier centuries once seemed to promise. They had instead learned, through the most difficult possible circumstances, to survive without it, adapting their own fundamental identity rather than simply enduring until circumstances once again allowed their traditional methods to function as originally designed. Individual sisters who lived through this transformation, according to whatever fragments of later reflection survive, describe genuine grief alongside genuine relief, mourning aspects of traditional sisterhood identity that this merger had necessarily altered or abandoned entirely, while recognizing simultaneously that this same transformation had ultimately preserved something considerably more important than any single traditional method or any single traditional boundary. The sisterhood's own continued existence as an institution, however changed, still capable of pursuing some version of its original underlying purpose into whatever future actually awaited it. This willingness to fundamentally transform, rather than simply persist unchanged until circumstances improved, deserves genuine recognition within this history's closing assessment. Evidence that whatever control the sisterhood had lost across the many centuries this account has traced, they retained, even in their most difficult moment, something considerably harder to lose entirely: the underlying discipline and underlying adaptability that had always sat, somewhat paradoxically, beneath their more famous reputation for careful, patient control. It is worth considering, too, how remarkable it actually was that this merger succeeded at all, given how thoroughly honored Matre and Bene Gesserit tradition had diverged across their considerable period of independent development. Mirbella's own particular position, having genuinely experienced both traditions from the inside, gave her a rare credibility neither a purely Bene Gesserit nor a purely honored Matre leader could have possibly claimed, allowing her to navigate the genuine mutual suspicion and genuine mutual resentment that might otherwise have doomed any attempted combination of two traditions this fundamentally different in their underlying values and underlying methods. This success, however genuinely earned, still required real sacrifice from sisters on both sides of the eventual merger. A reminder that institutional survival, even when ultimately achieved, rarely arrives without genuine cost, and that the specific shape any surviving institution eventually takes is never quite identical to the shape its original founders once imagined it would someday hold. The specific terms under which Bene Gesserit and honored Matre tradition ultimately merged deserve brief further mention here, since the process required considerable negotiation and considerable compromise from senior figures on both sides, each tradition surrendering certain long-held practices while insisting on preserving others considered genuinely essential to their own respective institutional identity. This negotiation, conducted under the genuine pressure of continuing external threat, produced an outcome considerably more improvised and considerably less carefully planned than either tradition's own historical approach to institutional development would normally have favored. That this improvised, pressured merger ultimately succeeded, producing an institution capable of continuing forward where either tradition alone might well have eventually failed entirely, offers its own quiet testament to the genuine adaptability underlying even the most tradition-bound institutions when circumstances leave no remaining alternative. The wider Imperium's own reaction to this unprecedented merger proved considerably more mixed than either Bene Gesserit or honored Matre leadership might have hoped. Some observers viewing the combination as a genuinely promising development capable of stabilizing a galaxy still recovering from the devastating conflict, others viewing it with considerable suspicion, uncertain what values and what priorities this newly merged institution would actually pursue going forward. This mixed reception itself illustrates how thoroughly the merger represented genuine transformation rather than simple restoration, producing something the wider Imperium had genuinely never encountered before, and therefore could not easily categorize using their existing understanding of either prior tradition. Mirbella's own leadership across these difficult early years of the merged institution required constant, careful navigation of exactly this uncertainty, building legitimacy for something genuinely new, while honoring enough of both prior traditions to maintain the loyalty and the continued participation of sisters and honored Matres alike. Later generations within the merged institution would come to view this difficult, improvised transformation with a complicated mixture of gratitude and genuine loss, recognizing that survival itself had required accepting a version of their shared tradition considerably different from what either founding institution had originally intended to become. A bittersweet outcome this history does not wish to resolve into any simpler, more comfortable verdict. Individual sisters who had lost close companions during the Honored Mattress's earlier devastating campaign found the merger particularly difficult to accept emotionally. Even while recognizing its practical necessity, a genuinely human tension between institutional survival and personal grief that this history does not wish to resolve too neatly on their behalf. That quiet grief mattered too. Up next in Chapter 20, what control actually meant all along, we'll close this complete history by naming, as clearly as we can, exactly what the sisterhood's long, complicated relationship with control actually reveals about institutions like theirs. Looking back now across the complete span of this history, from Jessica's quiet, private choice at Caladan through the devastating jihad, through Alia's tragic transformation and Leto's independent, millennia-spanning vision, through the scattering and the near destruction the Honored Mattress nearly completed, a single thread runs consistently through every single chapter, that the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, for all their genuine sophistication and genuine patience, never actually possessed the total institutional control their careful public reputation so often suggested, and that this absence of total control, examined honestly, tells us something considerably more interesting than any simple story of institutional failure ever could. Every major turning point this history has traced flowed, in the end, from individual human choice, Jessica's love for Leto, Paul's own determination to survive and then to lead, Alia's unprepared inheritance of overwhelming ancestral memory, Leto II's own radical, independent vision, entire populations choosing to scatter beyond any institutional reach specifically to escape exactly the kind of oversight the sisterhood's careful methods depended upon. None of these choices occurred because the sisterhood's planning had somehow failed on its own specific terms. They occurred because planning of this scale and this ambition, depending as it inevitably must on countless individual human beings making their own choices across countless individual circumstances, can never actually guarantee the specific outcomes it hopes to produce, no matter how many centuries of patient preparation precede any particular moment of decision. This history does not intend this observation as any kind of dismissal of what the sisterhood actually accomplished across their long institutional existence. They built something genuinely remarkable, a tradition of discipline and careful observation and patient cultivation that shaped the entire trajectory of human civilization across thousands of years, producing consequences of genuine historical magnitude, even when, and perhaps especially when, those consequences moved considerably beyond anything their own careful planning had actually intended. What this history hopes you carry forward from this long telling, as sleep finally arrives, is something considerably gentler than any grand lesson about institutional failure. A simple, quiet recognition that even the most careful, most patient planning any of us ever attempt, across our own individual lives and our own individual ambitions, exists always in relationship with forces considerably larger than our own capacity to fully predict or fully control. The sisterhood planned brilliantly. They also, again and again, discovered that brilliant planning is never quite the same thing as actual control, and that the difference between the two is where the real story of any sufficiently ambitious, sufficiently long-term human endeavor actually unfolds. There is something genuinely worth sitting with in this final recognition. That control, in the totalizing sense the word usually implies, was perhaps never really available to the sisterhood at all, not because their methods were somehow flawed, but because control of that kind is simply not available to anyone attempting something this vast, this dependent on countless other people's own free, unpredictable choices. What remained available to them across every single crisis this history has traced was something considerably more modest and considerably more durable. The discipline to keep working carefully, even without guarantee of outcome. The patience to adapt when circumstances demanded it, and the quiet, stubborn continuity that carried their institution, however transformed. All the way from a single private choice on a single quiet world through thousands of years of consequence, neither they nor anyone else could have ever fully foreseen. If nothing else survives from tonight's long telling, let this much remain: that discipline patiently practiced, without any guarantee of the control it might have once seemed to promise, can still accomplish something genuinely lasting, a lesson worth carrying gently with you now, as this long history finally, quietly comes to its own close, and sleep itself begins carrying you the rest of the way. Perhaps the gentlest way to close this long telling is simply to notice how deeply human the entire story actually was, for all its galaxy-spanning scale and its centuries-spanning timeline. Every single turning point traced back, in the end, to something recognizably, ordinarily human: a mother's love, a son's endurance, a daughter's unprepared inheritance, an entire population's understandable wish to be free of anyone else's careful, patient oversight. The sisterhood story, examined this closely, is not really a story about institutions and their limits at all, not fundamentally. It is a story about what happens when careful, patient planning meets the irreducible, unpredictable reality of actual human lives, lived by actual people who will always, in the end, retain some final measure of choice no amount of careful cultivation can ever quite fully remove. None of this diminishes what the sisterhood actually built across their long centuries of patient work, nor does it suggest their careful methods were somehow misguided from the very beginning. It suggests instead something considerably gentler and considerably more universal: that any institution, however wise, however patient, however sophisticated, remains ultimately made up of individual people, and individual people, loved and taught and shaped as carefully as any institution might manage, will always retain their own final capacity to choose otherwise. This is not a flaw in institutional design. It is simply the basic, unavoidable texture of what it actually means to build anything lasting through the cooperation of countless free human beings across countless generations. And so this complete history closes not with any tidy final verdict, but with something closer to companionship. An invitation to notice how thoroughly your own quiet, unglamorous discipline, practiced faithfully across your own ordinary days, might matter every bit as much as any grand institutional plan, whatever shape your own particular future eventually happens to take. And so we come, softly, to the end of the complete history, though the true, full weight of what the sisterhood actually lost across these long centuries stretches far beyond anything a single telling could ever fully hold. Tonight, we began with a plan that was never truly whole, seeds planted across 1,000 worlds, whose outcomes no single sister could ever fully predict, and a breeding index stretching across more generations than any one controller could ever actually oversee. We watched Jessica receive her careful assignment, and then, quietly, irreversibly, break it. We followed a Kwisatz Haderach, who arrived one generation too soon, and a Gamjabar test that offered the very first warning of exactly how little control the sisterhood actually retained over what they had built. We traced Paul's education beyond anything the curriculum ever intended, and watched Caladan fall in a single night that shattered whatever timeline careful sisterhood planning had once imagined. We saw their own seeded prophecy turned back against them, watched Muad'Dib rise beyond anyone's careful design, and lived through a jihad the sisterhood never once authorized. We named Alia's abomination for the tragedy it truly was, and watched the sisterhood reduced to careful, powerless observers under Paul's empire. We followed Leto II's entirely independent vision, endured 3,500 years of patient, powerless waiting, and watched humanity scatter itself finally, completely beyond their reach. We stood beside them against the honored Matres, an enemy their centuries of careful calculation never once predicted, and watched proud, ancient Bene Gesserit tradition bend painfully into something new entirely, simply to survive. There is nothing left now that you must carry. Let each of these old, patient names sink away from you, down through still dark water, growing fainter and fainter until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. None of this can touch you, and nothing here asks anything of you. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like mist over a quiet lake. Good night. If this long history carried you toward rest, stay with us, and let a gentle subscribe keep them coming. There are many more long, slow tales waiting for the nights ahead.